Tonight, we're leaving the highways and stepping into the dust-choked streets of places Texas forgot. Towns where the roofs collapsed, the wells dried up, and the lights never truly went out. This is 20 true creepy stories from Texas ghost towns. From drowned churches that ring their bells underwater to lanterns that still pace through empty miner shacks. These aren't campfire myths. They're the whispers people swear they heard when no one else was there. Before we begin, a quick warning. Most viewers make one mistake. They watch to the end and forget to subscribe. Then they miss the next nightmare waiting in the ruins. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now and join the few who keep coming back after midnight. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Because out here, the clocks in these towns stopped decades ago, but the stories didn't. Kill the lights. Turn the volume up. Let's walk the main streets the maps don't show anymore, and meet the shadows that never moved on. Let's dive into the darkness. I first heard about Terlingua in the back booth of a roadside diner off Highway 90, the kind of place with greasy counters and waitresses who call you Han without looking up from the pot of coffee. The guy telling the story was a trucker, rough-looking, eyes lined from sun and smoke. The sort of man you half listen to until he says something that lands with weight. He said he'd pulled over near the ruins of Terlingua one night, thinking it was just another broken mining town in the desert, good for a smoke and a stretch. But while he leaned on his rig, he saw lanterns glowing inside one of the adobe husks, swinging slow like someone was carrying them room to room. No noise, no cars, just the light. He left quick and his last words stuck with me. It's not a place for the living after sundown. I didn't tell him I'd been planning to head that way already. I had a fascination with ghost towns, not the tourist traps with plaques and souvenir stands, but the ones left to rot where nature swallows the bones of what people built. Terlingua sat right on the edge of Big Bend country, a scatter of abandoned houses, rusted cars, crumbling chimneys. I told myself I was going for photos, but if I'm being honest, I wanted to feel the weight of history pressing down. There's something about walking where people once lived and seeing it emptied out that pulls me like a magnet. The first time I drove into Terlingua, it was still daylight. The desert sprawled in every direction, red rock and cactus, the air so dry it burned your throat. I parked near the old cemetery where the graves are marked with wooden crosses leaning at strange angles. Some had offerings, beer cans, faded plastic flowers, trinkets so sun-bleached they looked ghostly themselves. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears because nothing breaks it. The buildings were shells, adobe walls half collapsed, tin roofs rusted through, doorways standing without doors. The town once thrived on mercury mining, and you could feel the poison still clinging to the soil, like the earth itself remembered. I spent hours wandering, taking pictures of stone chimneys jutting against the sky, an old church where the roof had caved in, and a general store with shelves collapsed under dust. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest ache, but when the sun started lowering and the shadows reached long, I felt something else, a pressure like eyes on my back. I told myself it was just the desert night closing in, but I packed up quicker than I'd planned. Still, the trucker's story gnawed at me. Lanterns moving in a place where no one lived. I wanted to see for myself, so a week later I came back. This time I stayed after dark. The desert night falls heavy. It's not like the city, where there's always a glow on the horizon. Out there, once the sun bleeds out, it's a blanket of black, stitched only with stars sharp as glass. I parked the car on the dirt road and killed the engine. The silence was alive, if that makes sense. My footsteps crunched on gravel, too loud, like the sound carried miles. I walked past the cemetery again. The crosses stood like black teeth against the starlight. I found one of the bigger ruins, a house with a roof half intact. I leaned against the doorway and waited. Minutes stretched. The wind came low, brushing the dry weeds. Nothing moved. I almost laughed at myself for buying into some trucker's tale. Then I saw it. A glow, faint at first, flickering inside a house across the way. Not flashlight white, but golden, warm. Lantern light. It swayed, dipping and lifting, just as if someone carried it slowly through the rooms. I held my breath. My mind scrambled for logic, another traveler, maybe a camper like me. But I hadn't seen a single car, not for miles. The place was empty, and yet the light moved steady, crossing the windows one by one. I forced my feet forward. The glow retreated deeper into the house and I followed, heart hammering. When I stepped into the doorway, the light vanished. Just like that. The room was nothing but dust, broken boards, a smell of old earth. I stood there shaking, the silence so complete it rang. I turned to leave, and in the far corner of the room, something caught the faint starlight. A piece of glass. A cracked lantern globe, blackened with soot, resting on the dirt floor. Cold. Unlit. I backed out and almost tripped over a stone. When I steadied myself, the glow was back, only now not in one house but two, lights swinging gently in different ruins like miners moving with purpose, lanterns guiding them through the bones of their homes. My chest seized up. I could feel something shift in the air, a heaviness that made my skin prickle. And then I heard it, faint, almost buried by the wind. Voices, low, muffled, like men talking through cloth. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was workmanlike, urgent. I should have run then, but fascination rooted me. The lights grew brighter, swaying faster. The voices sharpened, ragged, almost panicked. It felt like I was intruding on something I had no right to witness, a mining shift that never ended. Men trapped in their last endless circuit. My throat was dry, but I forced myself to whisper hello like maybe they were real. The lights froze. Every glow went still like lanterns held motionless. And then they blinked out. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. It was crushing, the kind that makes your ears pop. I turned and bolted, stumbling through weeds and rubble, not caring if I cut myself on rusted metal or stone. I didn't look back until I reached the cemetery. And when I did, I wished I hadn't. The whole town glowed faintly, every ruin pulsing with dull amber light like hundreds of lanterns burning behind broken walls. They didn't sway anymore. They burned steady as if every house was alive again, filled with miners who never left, windows glowing in quiet defiance of the dark desert. I don't remember getting to my car, only that I slammed the door and started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights cut across the cemetery, and in that brief wash I saw shapes between the graves, figures hunched, heads down, holding lanterns that didn't throw shadows. I drove blind into the night, dust rising like smoke in my mirrors. I've been back through Big Bend since then, but I won't go near Terlingua. Day or night. Some places don't want you. Some towns never die, they just keep their people, trapped in an endless loop working by lantern light. And if you stay too long, if you listen too closely, they'll notice you. They'll freeze, waiting, deciding if you belong to the living or if you're just another miner lost in the dark, ready to pick up the lamp and join the shift forever. I drove into Glen Rio because I wanted to see what the ghosts of Route 66 looked like. It wasn't my first time chasing after forgotten places, but something about the Texas-New Mexico border always called to me. The desert there has a weight in the air, as if every abandoned car and peeling billboard remembers more than it should. Glen Rio was different. The town was a casualty of the interstate bypass left to rot in the 70s. A row of hollow motels, a diner with broken windows, and a filling station that still smelled faintly of oil and dust. No one lives there now. Not really. But people say if you stay long enough, you'll hear voices in the night. I didn't believe it until the first time I parked my car by one of the motels just after sundown. The air was still warm from the day, but once the sun dropped, the wind carried a colder bite. The neon sign above the old blue swallow look-alike flickered faintly, though there was no power to it. I sat in the car watching the shape of the buildings sink into the shadows. That's when I first heard it. A murmur faint like a TV on in another room. It came from the boarded windows of the motel closest to me, a woman's voice, soft, steady, as though she were talking to someone behind closed doors. I thought maybe another urban explorer had beat me there. I stepped out, gravel crunching under my boots, and the sound stopped instantly. The silence was so thick it rang in my ears. I walked closer, pressed my hand against the rotting wood that covered the doorframe. No sound, just the whistle of wind across the empty road. I told myself it was just the wind, the acoustics, the desert playing tricks. I didn't go inside. Not yet. I slept in my car that night, or at least I tried. Around 2 a.m, I woke to tapping on the glass. Not a knock, not the sharp rap of a branch or bug. Tapping. A finger rhythm. Deliberate. My blood went cold. I sat up, heart hammering, and peered out into the black stretch of road. No one. Just the empty shell of the diner and the cracked streetlights. I told myself it was a dream. But when I looked at the dust on the glass, I saw 3 fresh streaks as if fingertips had trailed down. I turned the ignition, left the headlights on, and stared at the buildings until the horizon lightened with dawn. That was my first night in Glen Rio. I should have left then, but there's something magnetic about fear when it's tied to a place. Curiosity erodes caution. The next day I walked through the diner. Inside, dust coated everything. The counter stools were ripped open, spilling like guts. A stack of chipped plates sat under the window, untouched for decades. Yet in the middle of the floor, the dust was disturbed, scuffed into arcs and heel marks as though people had been moving around recently. I bent down, touched the track of one, and the dust clung to my fingers as if it were damp. My stomach turned. The silence in there was heavy, broken only by a sudden clatter in the kitchen. I froze. When I finally dared to look, I saw a metal pie tin spinning in place on the floor until it slowed to a stop. I ran out into the bright daylight, shaking like a fool. That evening, as the desert sky dimmed into purple, I went back to the motel where I'd first heard the voice. Something inside me needed proof. I found a loose board and pulled it aside, enough to squeeze through. The air hit me like a wall, must rot, something sweet underneath, almost like perfume gone sour. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the wallpaper curling like peeling skin. Every room door hung crooked on its hinges, numbered plaques barely hanging on. I walked slowly, light from my phone shaking in my hand. Room 4 was the first to catch me off guard. On the bed, which should have been nothing but rusted springs, there was a mattress. Clean. White sheets folded tight like it had been made yesterday. A Bible sat open on the nightstand, though the pages were blank, every one of them. As I flipped through, the sound came again. A whisper. A woman's voice, clearer this time. "Don't stay." I dropped the book and stumbled back, and when I blinked, the bed was nothing but springs again. No mattress. No sheets, nothing. I bolted from the room, but the hall stretched longer than it had before. My phone light flickered and died, though the battery was full. In the dark, the whispers grew louder, multiplying. Men's voices, children's voices, all layered over each other. 1,000 hushed conversations bleeding into one. They weren't speaking English. Or maybe they were, but it was backward, warped. I covered my ears, but the sound pressed against my skull from the inside. I ran until I found the gap I'd entered through and burst back into the night air, gasping like I'd been drowning. Behind me, the whispers didn't fade immediately. They lingered, carried on the wind as though they'd followed me out. I left Glen Rio at dawn, swore I'd never come back. But here's the part I can't shake. 2 weeks after, at home in Amarillo, I woke one night to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. 3 soft taps in the same rhythm I'd heard on my car glass. My curtains moved slightly, though the window was shut tight. I sat there frozen until the tapping stopped. I told myself it was in my head, the residue of fear. But the next morning, in the dew on the outside of the glass, I saw 3 fresh streaks trailing downward, like fingertips dragging slow. Since then, I've heard whispers when I'm alone. Faint murmurs that stop when I strain to listen. Sometimes I wake to find the Bible on my nightstand cracked open, though I never placed one there, and the pages, at least in my house, are no longer blank. They're filled with words written in a hand I don't recognize over and over, the same sentence scrawled until the page turns gray. Don't stay. I grew up not far from Thurber, and for most of my life I thought the stories about the mines were just something people whispered to spook tourists. The town itself is quiet now, just a scattering of ruins and a handful of brick chimneys that point up like broken teeth against the sky. In the evenings, the wind whistles through the crumbling bricks and the silence presses down like a weight. I used to drive through there on my way to see my cousin in Strawn, and every time, even in daylight, the place felt wrong, as if the ground itself didn't want to be disturbed. People say that under Thurber are tunnels so deep and tangled they could swallow a whole city, shafts collapsing in on themselves, coal dust still choking the air, and down there, if you stand still long enough, you can hear the miners begging for air. I never believed it until the summer of 2017, when I made the mistake of stopping there after dark. I was driving back from Fort Worth, trying to beat a storm that was rolling in. Lightning cut across the horizon and rain smeared across my windshield. By the time I hit Thurber, the storm had overtaken me, and my old truck was coughing like it was about to die. I pulled off near one of the old chimneys, figuring I'd wait it out. The place looked deserted. Just rain soaking through weeds and rust dripping from fences that hadn't seen maintenance in 50 years. But I could feel something even before I cut the engine. Like the land itself was breathing under me, slow and heavy, as though there were lungs buried deep in the rock. At first, it was only the storm. Thunder cracking, rain hammering the roof. Then beneath it came another sound, faint at first, like wind caught in a hollow pipe. But it wasn't wind. It was human. I froze, leaning forward, straining to hear through the downpour. It was a voice, low and muffled, coming up through the ground, as if the earth were speaking through a mouth full of dirt. Then another joined it and another. Ragged, wet with fear, the words were broken but desperate. "Help!" one of them cried. "God help me." My first thought was that some poor soul had fallen down one of the old shafts. But these mines had been closed for nearly a century, sealed and forgotten. There shouldn't have been anyone down there. I stepped out into the rain and the voices got louder. It wasn't just one or two, it was a chorus, dozens of them, all overlapping, gasping, choking, crying out for help. Some prayed, some screamed for their wives, some cursed, their words tearing at the night like claws. The sound rose and fell in waves as though the earth itself was convulsing with them. My skin prickled cold despite the Texas heat, and I felt my legs wanting to run back to the truck. But something made me step closer to the chimney. The red brick slick with rain, black streaks running down it like old soot tears. The ground there seemed to tremble under my boots, as if a pulse beat inside the soil. I wanted to believe it was just the storm playing tricks, thunder bouncing through the empty structures, but no storm has voices that beg by name. One voice broke through the others, loud and clear. It sounded like it was directly under me, only a few feet down. "They left us," it moaned. "Don't let us die here." My heart clenched so tight I couldn't breathe. I staggered back, and that's when I saw it. The ground beneath the chimney shifting. Not like a cave-in, but like something was pressing upward, straining against the soil, trying to break through. The earth rose and sank like a chest struggling for air. I bolted to the truck, fumbling the keys with wet fingers. The voices rose higher, shrieks tearing from the ground as if they knew I was leaving. One screamed so loud it cut through the thunder, a raw, inhuman sound that rattled in my skull. I slammed the truck into gear and peeled out, gravel spitting under the tires. In the rear view, I swore I saw a figure clawing its way up from the earth, blackened hands slick with mud reaching for the sky. Then the storm swallowed it all and the road carried me away. For days afterward, I couldn't shake it. The sound of those voices clung to me, replaying in my head at night. I'd wake up sweating, convinced I could still hear them under my house, beneath my floorboards, crying out from the dark. I told myself it was imagination, a mix of thunder and fear. But then the dream started. I dreamed I was down in those mines, trapped in choking dust and darkness, men screaming around me, the timbers cracking and giving way. I dreamed of gas flooding the tunnels, burning my lungs, men clawing at walls until their nails tore off. In every dream I died, but I always woke up before the final collapse. And every time I woke with dirt under my nails and the taste of coal in my throat. I finally went back to Thurber in daylight, just to prove to myself there was nothing there. The storm had passed, the ruins stood empty in the sun, and the ground looked solid, undisturbed. But when I walked to that same chimney, I saw something that stopped me cold. The dirt around its base was black, not just from soot, but from something fresh, wet, as if the earth itself had bled. And there, half buried in the mud, was a miner's helmet, rusted through but with a strap still intact. I kicked it over and the inside was charred. The lining fused to the metal like it had been burned into place. I didn't stay after that. I don't go near Thurber anymore, not even in daylight. But sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I hear it again. Not from the ground, not from the town, but inside my own walls. Muffled cries rising through the floorboards, begging for air, for light, for release. I think they followed me back that night, and I don't think they'll ever stop until I join them under the ground. I was raised in towns like Sherwood, old Texas places where time forgets its obligations and leaves buildings standing like skeletons of another life. Sherwood had been a county seat once, before the railroad pulled away and the courthouse went quiet. People left. Families drifted into towns with light and work, and Sherwood Square sagged into silence. The courthouse was still there, though. Pale limestone in the moonlight, its tower long stripped of a bell. They say the only sound left is the wind, but that isn't true. Not if you've been inside. Not if you've seen her. I went there when I was 21. Back then I had a camera, cheap batteries, and a fascination with things better left alone. Ghost stories clung to that courthouse like ivy, and one name kept surfacing: the woman in white. They said she drifted the hallways at night, her face shrouded, her hands dragging across the doors. When morning came, fresh scratches marred the wood. Claw marks etched deeper every year. Folks in nearby towns said Sherwood was cursed, but curses were good currency for a young man chasing a thrill. I wanted proof. What I got was something that never left me. It was October, and I remember how the air was brittle, sharp enough to carry the smell of dust even before I reached the square. The courthouse loomed against the sky, all its windows black. The town itself was dead. No dogs, no lights, just the faint creak of a sign that used to advertise a feed store. I parked my car and left the engine running, because some part of me already knew I might need to leave quickly. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper, mildew, and something metallic that didn't belong. The moonlight poured through a cracked skylight and striped the floorboards in white bands. The first thing I noticed were the doors. Heavy oak, scarred as though something with nails too long for human hands had raked them from top to bottom. Some scratches were pale and fresh. Others were dark, like blood had seeped into the grooves long ago. I put my hand on one of them, feeling the ridges. It was cold. Colder than the air around me. My breath smoked faintly, though the night hadn't yet dropped that low. I crept further in past the old clerk's office. Piles of records lay scattered. Pages chewed by rats and stained from water that must have dripped in for decades. My flashlight beam twitched across portraits on the wall. Stern men in coats staring with eyes blurred from time. In the courtroom, the benches leaned, warped from heat and age, and the judge's chair stood like a throne in the dark. I thought about the trials that must have been held there. Hangings ordered, sentences passed, maybe men and women dragged out screaming. That place had soaked in every ounce of human misery it was given, and it hadn't let go. That's when I heard the sound. Soft, like a dress hem dragging across the floor. I froze. The sound drew closer, steady, and I realized it was not just dragging, it was wet. Like cloth soaked in water, my flashlight stuttered across the far corner, and there she was. A figure in white, tall and thin, drifting with no sound of footsteps. Her head was bowed, face hidden by a veil that looked burned at the edges, but her hands. They hung low too long, fingers tipped with dark stains. She pressed them against a door frame as she passed, and I swear I heard wood splinter. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted. She stopped as if she could smell me and slowly lifted her head. I wish I could say I saw her eyes, but there were none. Just black sockets that seemed to reach back forever. When her mouth opened, it was not to scream, but to exhale. The sound was like 100 whispers, all murmuring names at once. My flashlight died then, leaving only the faint gray of moonlight, and in that pale glow I saw her step closer. The floorboards didn't creak under her weight. She wasn't walking. She was gliding. I stumbled backward, and my hand brushed against one of the scratched doors. For a second, it felt alive beneath my palm, like something was pulsing behind it. I bolted. Through the clerk's office, past the portraits, across the courthouse hall where every door now seemed to rattle as if shaken from within. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear her, that wet, dragging sound, closer, closer. When I reached the front doors, they slammed shut in my face. I clawed at them, screamed, but they wouldn't budge. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, a tide of voices rising to a roar, and then silence. I turned, and she was inches away. The veil stirred, though there was no breeze, and her hands rose. The clawed tips hovered just over my chest, and I felt heat, not cold, searing as though something inside me was being branded. Her head tilted, and for one heartbeat I thought she might pass through me. Instead, she lowered her hands and traced the door beside us, carving deep lines in the wood. Then she was gone, just gone. The courthouse fell back into silence, and the doors swung open with no effort at all. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, until the courthouse was nothing but a silhouette in my rearview mirror. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I saw red streaks across my shirt, though no cuts lay beneath. They faded by morning, but the mark she carved in that door stayed. I went back years later with a friend, just to prove it wasn't some fever dream. The courthouse was more decayed, the air heavier, but the scratches were there. Fresh ones too. My friend wouldn't even go inside. People say the woman in white is just a tale, something to scare off trespassers. They say she's a widow from the old trials, or a victim of a hanging or something older than the town itself. I don't care what she is. I only know that she's real, If you ever stand in the square of Sherwood at night and feel the wind shift cold, don't look at the courthouse windows, because sometimes she's there, watching, and if she decides to follow, you'll never forget her touch. Not for the rest of your life. The first time I heard about Indianola, I thought it was just another ghost story told by coastal Texans to keep kids from wandering too close to the water at night. A town swallowed by hurricanes in the 1800s, its ruins still buried under the Gulf, and the strange claim that when storms roll in, bells ring beneath the waves as though the drowned city itself refuses to stay quiet. I didn't believe it. But that disbelief didn't last long. Not after I saw what I saw. I was working on a book about vanished towns of the American South, half history, half folklore, and Indianola kept coming up. It wasn't like the other places. Most ghost towns leave behind boards, stone chimneys, maybe a collapsed church if you're lucky. Indianola had been flattened twice, burned, then finally drowned for good. Nothing to visit, just an empty stretch of coastline where the wind feels heavier, saltier. But old records spoke of churches, of heavy brass bells that had been hauled in from Europe, bells too massive to move when the hurricanes came. They say when the storms howl and the tides rise, those bells toll under the Gulf like a funeral dirge. That's what drew me to Indianola one summer when hurricane season was just beginning to stir. I rented a small weathered cabin in Port Lavaca and spent my days combing archives, reading brittle diaries, yellowed news clippings, and fading church ledgers. But I also walked the beach at Indianola itself. The shoreline felt wrong, as though it was balancing between two worlds. The sand was always damp no matter the tide, and when the wind came in off the Gulf, it carried more than just the smell of salt and seaweed. Sometimes it carried voices not sharp enough to understand, but soft enough to convince you that you weren't alone. It was on the third evening that I noticed the marker stones, low moss-crusted things half buried in the sand near a cluster of live oaks. At first I thought they were gravestones. Some had dates carved shallowly, 1856, 1875, 1886, years that matched the hurricane seasons. But others were unmarked, just stone lumps stuck in the earth like teeth. Behind them, tangled in the oaks, was what remained of a cemetery fence. Rusted iron bent into the suggestion of a rectangle. The Indianola Cemetery. Nobody had told me it was still there. That night the storm came. Not a hurricane, but a heavy squall. One of those Gulf tempests that crashes in without warning. I sat awake in the cabin, wind rattling the shutters, rain slamming the roof like 1,000 hands. And then I heard it. Low rolling, impossible through the roar of thunder and surf, but unmistakable. A bell tolling, not just one, but several. Each one slightly out of time with the others, like a choir singing underwater. I thought it was the wind at first, or some distant boat warning offshore. But when I stepped outside onto the porch, rain stinging my face, the sound grew clearer. It was coming from Indianola. I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m, I drove back down the soaked road, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The Gulf was monstrous, waves exploding against the shore, froth racing up onto the road. The cemetery was there, black against the whitecaps. And through the thunder, the bells tolled again. I left the truck and stumbled through the rain toward the stones. My feet sank into sand, turned to muck, water pulling at my ankles as though the ocean wanted me. The sound grew sharper as I approached, deep metallic groans that rolled up from beneath the ground. The graves trembled. I swear I saw the stones shift, the earth around them bubbling like something beneath was trying to force its way up. And then, between the lightning strikes, I saw figures. Tall, pale, featureless outlines standing among the markers. They weren't solid, but they weren't just tricks of light either. They swayed with the tolling like mourners in some endless ceremony. Each peal of the bells bent them, pulled them toward the surf, then back toward the graves. When I moved, they turned. They didn't have faces, but I knew they were looking. I backed away, my boots sucking against the wet ground, heart hammering. A wave surged up and washed over the stones, but the figures didn't vanish. They only grew darker, like the sea itself was painting them in. The bells struck louder, closer, until I thought my eardrums would split. The storm above seemed to mimic the rhythm, thunder and surf sinking to the clang of metal beneath the water. I don't remember running to the truck, only the slam of the door and the ignition stuttering before the engine caught. I drove blind through the storm, windshield wipers useless, the sound of bells chasing me until the cabin lights finally broke through the dark. By dawn, the storm had moved on. The sky was washed clean, the Gulf calm again. But I didn't go back to Indianola that day, not then. I left after another sleepless night, drove inland, told myself I'd write the story anyway. But the sound followed me. Weeks later, in the dead of night, when storms rolled across Austin, I heard it again through my apartment walls. Low, metallic, muffled but steady, a bell tolling from beneath the ground. I tried to drown it out with music, with television, with anything. But it always came back. Sometimes faint, sometimes so loud I thought the windows would crack. I dream of water filling the streets, of graves opening, of faceless figures standing in the dark waiting for me to join them. The bells of Indianola are not bound to the Gulf. They belong to the dead, and the dead carry them wherever they go. I think now that the moment I stepped into that cemetery, I was marked. That sound is not a warning, it's a summons. And one night soon, when the storm is right, I know I'll hear them outside my door. Not faint, not distant, but loud and clear, ringing for me, calling me back to the water where they wait. The oak tree stands on the outskirts of Barstow, Texas, its crooked branches rising like black arms clawing at the desert sky. It's been there longer than the town itself, twisted and gnarled, a shape that unsettles the eye no matter how long you stare at it. People around here call it the hanging tree, not in the way children nickname a place for thrills, but with the sort of grim respect given to something that has taken lives. Its bark is scarred with strange grooves, some long, some in circles, like ropes rubbed into it until the wood itself remembered the pressure. Old-timers in town will tell you that it groans when there's no wind, a long aching sound like wood bending under weight. More than one ranch hand swore they heard the squeak of rope and the faint creak of a body swinging, even though the branches were still as bone. I first heard about the tree from my uncle, who worked in the oil fields nearby in the 70s. He said the foreman warned new hires not to linger around it after dark. Men who stopped there on their way home sometimes didn't come back. A driller named Hawkins parked his truck under it one summer evening to take a nap. When the crew came looking, they found the truck with the keys still in the ignition, headlights on, the driver's side door wide open. Hawkins was gone, and the only sign of him was the deep impression of his boots in the dirt beneath the tree, facing upward, as if he'd been standing on something invisible that had suddenly been kicked out from under him. I didn't believe those stories. Barstow is a dry, tired little place, half a ghost town itself, and people cling to folklore out here because it's the only thing that keeps the land interesting. But curiosity does ugly things to a man, and one August night when I was driving back from Pecos, I decided to stop. The tree rose against the horizon like a silhouette cut sharper than the desert itself. My truck's engine idled rough, like it didn't want to be there, and when I cut the headlights, the darkness swallowed the road so completely that only the pale bulk of the tree remained. At first there was nothing but the hum of cicadas and the dry rasp of the wind dragging sand over asphalt. Then the silence thickened, the kind of silence you can feel in your teeth. I swear the branches shifted, not in a breeze but in a slow groan of wood moving against itself. I told myself it was just the heat cooling off the trunk, but then it came. The squeak. Rhythmic, faint, unmistakable. The sound of a rope stretched taut, twisting against bark. I got out of the truck and stood beneath it, half to prove I wasn't afraid and half because something in me wanted to hear it closer. The ground was bare dirt, no grass, no scrub, just the packed down earth of a place that has been walked over too often. My boots crunched in time with that groan, and when I tilted my head back, I saw something hanging from the thickest branch. It wasn't solid, not exactly. A shape more like heat shimmer than flesh, swaying gently though the air was still. My chest tightened and I couldn't move. It wasn't that I didn't want to, it was that I felt rooted, like the tree had me tethered. The shape twisted, and for a moment I could make out the outline of a face. The neck bent unnaturally to one side. The mouth opened wide, but no scream came. Just the creaking rope, steady and awful. My stomach lurched when I realized the sound wasn't coming from the air, but from the wood itself, as if the tree remembered every death it had hosted and was replaying them all at once. When I finally forced myself to step back, the dirt gave way beneath my heel, like I had been standing on something soft. I looked down, and in the pale starlight I saw depressions, foot-shaped hollows pressed deep into the ground, overlapping, countless of them, all circling the trunk. It was like every man who had ever swung from that tree had left behind an echo, and the soil had recorded each desperate kick. I ran back to the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. The headlights swept across the oak, and for just a second I saw them. Dozens of figures hanging there, faint and flickering like old film, their bodies swaying in the same rhythm, their faces slack and empty. As the engine roared, they vanished, but the sound followed me. That groan, that squeak riding on the air, fading only when the town lights of Barstow came into view. The locals don't go near the hanging tree anymore. Ranchers rerouted their fences and truckers take the long way around if they have to. Every so often, some outsider hears the story and stops to see it for themselves, and sometimes they come back shaken. Sometimes they don't come back at all. The sheriff doesn't bother writing up missing persons reports anymore when the tree is involved. He just shakes his head and says, "That damn oak took another one." As for me, I never stopped there again. But on quiet nights when the wind dies down and the desert holds its breath, I still hear it, that terrible groaning squeak, steady as a pendulum, swinging just outside the edge of my memory as though somewhere far off. The tree hasn't finished with me yet. Highway 90 stretches across the desert like a scar, thin and cracked, carrying dust and wind more often than people. Out here between Del Rio and Alpine, the towns shrink into clusters of rusted trailers and forgotten storefronts, places where even the gas stations stand hollow and gutted. I had been driving through this part of Texas for work, hauling survey equipment in the back of my truck. When I first passed through Lobo, it wasn't even on my map. Just a cluster of cinder block buildings and a row of boarded-up houses slouched against the desert sun. The road curved past an abandoned gas station, its windows black and coated with years of grime. And as I slowed down, I swore I saw a pale face staring back at me from the inside. Not just a trick of the glass or my tired eyes, but a distinct face, thin and almost gray, watching from behind the cracked pane. I slowed down further, half ready to stop, but something in me, some stubborn desert instinct, told me to keep going. I pressed the gas and left the place behind, but the image burned in my head the rest of the day. The thing about West Texas is that once something unsettles you, the emptiness around you only makes it worse. Mile after mile of scrub, dry creek beds, and the occasional windmill creaking in the wind. No cell service. No one around to say, "Hey, I saw it too." By the time I pulled into a motel in Van Horn that night, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Glass reflections, sun glare, exhaustion. Except when I shut off the truck and sat there in the cooling silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the face had been real, and worse, that it had noticed me too. The next morning, against better judgment, I went back. Curiosity is a dumb instinct, but it's stronger than fear when you're alone on the road with too much time to think. Lobo looked even smaller in daylight. Half the buildings collapsing in on themselves, the gas station standing with its roof sagging like a broken spine. The pumps were long gone, ripped out of the concrete, and the windows were as black as I remembered. I parked on the shoulder and walked closer, boots crunching over broken glass and pebbles. The air smelled of dust and faint rot, like something had died inside long ago. I put my hands on the frame of the door, half hoping it was locked, but it swung open with a screech that set my teeth on edge. The interior was worse. A counter still stood, coated in decades of dirt, with the cash register gutted open. Shelves leaned empty against the walls. Rat droppings in the corners. The smell of mildew from a cooler door hanging off its hinges. The light was dim, only slivers cutting through the filth on the windows, but in the gloom I kept thinking I saw shapes. I took a step in and my boot echoed on the cracked tile. That was when I noticed the glass. Not just the windows, but fragments of broken mirrors scattered across the floor, some still leaning against the walls. Each one was dark, so dirty I couldn't see my reflection. And yet as I walked past, I thought I caught pale outlines moving just behind the surface, as though the glass was thinner than it should have been. Like something was on the other side. I didn't stay long. My nerves rattled and I told myself it wasn't worth it. Back in the truck, I pulled onto the highway and didn't look back. But that night in Alpine, I woke up at 2 a.m. with the certainty that someone was staring through the motel room window. The curtains were shut tight, but I felt it like heat on my skin. I didn't move for nearly an hour, just lay there listening to the hum of the air conditioner until exhaustion forced me under again. Over the next week, the job took me back and forth across that stretch of highway. And every time I passed Lobo, I found myself looking at those windows. Sometimes I thought I saw nothing but grime, but other times I swore there were faces. More than one. Men, women, maybe even children. Pale and silent behind the glass, their eyes following my truck as it passed. One afternoon, against all reason, I stopped again. The station looked the same, but when I glanced in the nearest window, a woman's face looked back at me. Thin lips, hollow cheeks, and eyes so dark they seemed bottomless. I froze, my hand on the truck door handle, and in that instant her mouth opened, wider than it should have, stretching in silence like a scream pressed against the glass. My stomach lurched and I floored it, gravel spitting behind me as I sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, the station shrank, but for a split second I saw more faces pressed against the windows, lining them like fish behind an aquarium pane. I didn't stop in Lobo again after that, but the dream started. Windows filled with gray hands pressed against them, eyes watching from the other side of the glass. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to see my own reflection in the motel mirror, twist and turn away from me, leaving me staring into a dark surface where my face should have been. My appetite slipped. My nerves frayed. At gas stations in other towns, I started to notice smudges in the windows, faint handprints like something had leaned close from the inside. Always from the inside. On the last day of the job, I packed up and headed east. When I reached the turnoff for Lobo, I told myself I'd keep driving. But the truck slowed of its own accord, or maybe I wanted it to. The sun was dropping, orange light bleeding across the desert, and the station stood there waiting. My pulse hammered as I pulled onto the shoulder again. I told myself it was the last time. Just one more look to prove something to myself, though I couldn't say what. The windows were almost black with the coming night, but as I approached, the shapes inside grew clear. Faces. Dozens now, all pale, all watching. Their mouths moved in unison, slow and soundless, and when I leaned closer, the glass grew cold beneath my hand, so cold it burned. The faces pressed closer too, noses flattening against the pane, eyes wide with hunger or grief, I couldn't tell which. Then, as the wind died and the desert fell silent, I realized I could hear them, not with my ears but somewhere deeper, like voices crawling inside my skull. They whispered about roads that never end, about nights that never lift, about glass that opens like water if you lean too close. My knees weakened and I stumbled back toward the truck, fumbling with the keys. As I started the engine, I made the mistake of glancing once more at the window. My own face stared back at me, pale, hollow, pressed against the glass from the inside. Its lips moved in silence with the rest. I screamed, floored the gas, and didn't stop until the station was long behind me. That was 3 months ago. I made it home, finished the job, tried to fold back into normal life. But every reflective surface has grown wrong. Bathroom mirrors, darkened windows, even the blank screen of my phone when it shuts off. I catch glimpses of myself, thinner, paler, always watching me from the other side. At night, I hear faint tapping on the bedroom window, even when I know the second floor is too high for anyone to reach. I don't go near glass anymore, cover every mirror I can, but it doesn't help. The faces are still there, waiting, and sometimes when I'm too tired to resist, I hear them whisper again. They want me back on Highway 90, back to Lobo, back to the dark windows. And I know that one night soon I won't have the strength to resist. I'll drive west again, and this time when I lean close, the glass won't hold me out. When Lake Buchanan was dammed in the 1930s, the water swallowed the little town of Bluffton whole. Families packed their belongings into wagons. Churches dismantled their steeples, and whatever they couldn't carry was left to the rising flood. For years after, locals said you could still see the rooftops under the shallows when the water level dropped. The skeletal frames of houses like a drowned graveyard. By the time I came around, the lake had long since become a summer getaway spot. People camped along the rocky banks, fished for bass, water skied, and swam. Nobody seemed to think much about the town that lay beneath, except for the old-timers who liked to remind you that there were graves down there. Not all the bodies had been moved. They always said it in a half-joking way, like they wanted to see how nervous you'd get, but in their eyes there was a seriousness that told you it wasn't just a campfire story. It was a warning. I didn't believe much of that until I took up scuba diving with a buddy of mine named Aaron. We were in our mid-20s, both reckless in the way young men get when they feel invincible. Lake diving wasn't like the clear waters you see on postcards. It was dark, full of silt and tangled branches, but the thrill of knowing an entire town lay underneath made it irresistible. One late summer evening, we got the idea to explore near the old town's footprint. Aaron had heard from a retired fisherman that on quiet nights, if the wind died down, you could hear music over the water, like a church choir far away. He laughed when he told me, but there was a flicker of unease in his grin. I thought it was just another lake myth, like the catfish as big as cars that supposedly lurked in the dam's shadows. Still, when he suggested we dive at dusk, I didn't say no. We set up on the shore where the rocks gave way to a gradual slope into the water. The sun was sinking, bleeding the sky into orange and violet. The lake was glass smooth, no boats, no wind, just the two of us suiting up with tanks and masks. I remember thinking how quiet it was, like the world was holding its breath. We waded in, the water warm at first, then cooler as it climbed over my chest, my shoulders, my head. Once under, everything changed. The lake swallowed the light. Even with the beam of my flashlight, it felt like swimming through ink. Silt swirled in the wake of every kick, tiny particles floating like dust in a forgotten attic. Shapes emerged slowly. A stone wall, a fence post, the ghost of a street that once carried wagons and Sunday shoes. The deeper we went, the more I felt the pressure not just in my ears but in my chest, as if the water itself didn't want us there. We found the remnants of a house, its roof collapsed, timbers rotted but still recognizable. Windows without glass stared out into the black. Aaron swam ahead, pointing, excited. I followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I turned my light across the murk, it reflected off something pale. At first I thought it was a fish belly up, but it lingered unmoving, almost like a face pressed against the current. I blinked and it was gone, just silt dispersing. My pulse hammered against the regulator. I didn't tell Aaron. I didn't want to be the one spooked. We swam past what must have been the church. The foundation was still visible, squared off stone that looked too deliberate to be natural. Aaron tapped my arm and pointed upward. I tilted my head and froze. Through the water above us came a sound, muffled but unmistakable. Voices. Not the sound of boats or engines, not the chatter of campers. These were human voices, layered, rising and falling together in strange harmony. A hymn. I knew it deep down in my bones even though I couldn't make out the words. It was as if the water carried an echo from another time. A Sunday service frozen in place, still rising from the drowned rafters. The hair on the back of my neck prickled even though the wetsuit covered me. Aaron's eyes behind his mask were wide, but instead of swimming up, he signaled to keep going, deeper toward the sound. We reached the altar. At least that's what it looked like. A stone platform covered in moss and silt, cracked but standing. My light swept across it and something moved. A shape, white like cloth drifting without a body. Then another. And another. They floated just beyond the edges of the beam, never fully visible but always there, circling us. The hymn grew louder. Not in my ears, but in my skull, like the water was vibrating with it. I couldn't breathe right, even with the regulator. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I reached for Aaron's arm to tell him we had to go, but he was staring, transfixed, his light locked on the altar. I shook him hard, bubbles bursting from his regulator as he finally looked at me. His eyes were wild, unfocused. I don't know if he saw me at all. Then he bolted upward, kicking toward the surface, flailing like something was dragging him back down. I followed, lungs screaming as the hymn roared louder, rising to a fever pitch. I swear I felt hands brushing against me, cold and bony, trying to pull me back into the dark. My light flickered, then went out, leaving me in total blackness except for the pale movements in the water. I kicked harder than I ever had, the weight of my tank pulling me down while panic pushed me up. The surface seemed impossibly far. My chest was on fire. Just as I thought I'd black out, I broke through, gasping, ripping the regulator from my mouth. The lake was calm, silent, the sky overhead a deep indigo with the first stars. But Aaron wasn't there. I spun in the water, shouting his name, but the lake gave nothing back. I saw bubbles break the surface 20 yards away, then nothing. I swam as hard as I could, but he never came up again. The sheriff's office called it an accident. They said lake diving was dangerous, currents unpredictable, divers disoriented in the dark. They dragged the area for days, but they never found his body. People said the lake keeps what it takes. I stopped diving after that. I stopped going near Lake Buchanan at all. But on certain nights, if the air is still and the moon is low, I swear I can hear it from miles away. Faint, rising through the black water, hymns, and sometimes a single voice among them, ragged and desperate, calling my name. The schoolhouse had been shut for 50 years, but it still stood on the edge of Katerina like a gray tooth no one had the heart to pull. The roof sagged, the windows had long since lost their glass, and the red bricks were scabbed with moss and dust. Kids in town told each other dares about breaking in, but the adults just shook their heads and muttered that it was best left alone. They never gave reasons, just warnings. the kind that carried weight in a place where stories lasted longer than buildings. I was 34 the first time I stepped inside. My uncle had been sheriff here in the 80s, and after his funeral, I stayed in Katerina a few days to sort through his things. On the last night, I went drinking at a bar that smelled of smoke and grease, and a group of old men were swapping stories. That was when I heard it. How even now, if you crept up to the school after dark, you might hear the chalk dragging across the board, spelling out names that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. They said the names belonged to the children who never came home after a scarlet fever outbreak, when the school had been hastily converted into a quarantine hall. The bodies had been hauled away, but the voices they whispered had stayed. I laughed it off at the time, though the way the bartender kept glancing toward the windows unsettled me. But back at my uncle's trailer, I couldn't shake it. Katerina was too quiet, the kind of place where silence feels thicker than darkness. So near midnight, I drove down the dirt road past the cotton fields and parked in front of the school. The air was hot and damp, crickets screaming from the weeds, and the moon painted the bricks pale. The front doors were chained, but one side gaped just enough for me to slip through. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old wood. My flashlight beam jittered over rows of desks, each one bolted to the floor, their lids warped and peeling like something half-digested. Dust lay thick over everything, except in strange, thin streaks, as if invisible fingers had drawn lines across the surfaces. I walked toward the blackboard, and that was when I heard it. Not loud, not obvious, but a faint squeak. The sound of chalk. I froze. My light found the blackboard, coated with 50 years of grime, and across its surface was a pale, fresh line curling down into the shape of a letter. My heart thudded so hard it shook the beam. I stood there watching as the chalk that wasn't there dragged another line. A name was slowly taking shape, each stroke pulled into being by nothing I could see. The letter spelled David Ramirez. The name meant nothing to me, but the way it stood out sharp and white against the black made my skin crawl. Before I could move, another name began forming beneath it. Sarah Luna, then another, Andres Villarreal. The chalk scraped and dragged, though no chalk was visible, and I swear I could hear breathing between the strokes, shallow and labored, like sick children struggling for air. I stumbled back, almost tripping over a desk, and the metal legs screeched across the floor. That noise woke something deeper in the building. At first I thought it was the wind through broken glass, but there was no glass, no wind. It was whispers. Dozens of them, thin and ragged, circling the room like they were afraid to speak up but couldn't stay silent. They didn't form words, not at first, just a tangle of voices rising and falling. Then slowly they grew louder, syllables bleeding through until I could understand fragments. Names. Please. Mama. Thirsty. Cold. It was all I could take. I bolted for the door, but when I turned, the doorway wasn't empty. They were there. Dozens of them. Small as children, but gray and hollow-eyed, standing shoulder to shoulder in the moonlight pouring through the open gap. Their clothes hung loose, old-fashioned, dirt-stained. Their mouths opened and shut but made no sound, as if they were still whispering, but their voices had been stolen. My flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, the chalk screeched faster, filling the board with names, the sound jagged, desperate like fingernails dragging bone. I dropped the light and pushed past them. I don't know how, but I ran right through those gray figures and out into the night. The air outside felt like breaking water, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I looked back, the school stood silent as it had for half a century. No faces in the door, no voices, no chalk, just shadows. I told myself I'd imagined it, that grief and whiskey had played tricks on me. But when I returned to my uncle's trailer, I opened one of his old files out of some instinct. Inside was a list of children buried in the Katerina cemetery during the scarlet fever outbreak. The first three names on the page were David Ramirez, Sarah Luna, and Andres Villarreal. I left the next morning, but Katerina doesn't leave me. Sometimes, just as I'm falling asleep, I hear that faint squeak of chalk in the back of my head, steady and patient, spelling something I'll never be able to erase. And when I dream, I see those hollow children in the doorway, their lips moving in silence, waiting for me to learn the words. The red road of Belle Plaine was a strip of dirt so faded it barely showed on modern maps, but everyone in Callahan County knew where it lay. It cut through mesquite and scrub brush like a scar that refused to heal. Its soil stained a deeper, richer red than the other back roads that wound through ranch land and cattle pastures. Farmers said it wasn't just clay. They said it had been soaked by too much blood in the years after the Civil War, when the land was lawless and the fastest draw decided who lived and who got left for buzzards. People didn't drive it at night unless they had to, and even then they sped without looking in the rearview mirror. The older folks swore you could see them out there if you dared to slow down. Men on horseback galloping in silence, their shirts torn open, their torsos shredded by old gunshot wounds, blood spilling from holes that never healed. I had heard the stories most of my life, but I wasn't the kind who believed in ghosts. My father used to laugh when locals muttered about phantom riders, saying Belle Plaine had been a boomtown that burned itself out long before my time. But he also told me something once when he'd had too much whiskey and his voice dropped into that low, shaky register a man uses when he's remembering something he'd rather forget. He said he saw them once when he was young, back when he and his cousin decided to cut across the road after midnight coming back from a dance in Baird. He said the night went suddenly cold, and the horses appeared on either side of their car, sprinting in dead silence. He swore the riders' eyes were rolled back white, mouths open but no sound coming, their wounds glistening in the moonlight. The horses didn't make a sound either, not even the thud of hooves. They just ran until the road forked, then vanished into the mesquite like smoke. My father had never driven that way again. That memory seemed to chew at him, though he would never admit it. I wasn't like him. I had an appetite for proving people wrong, a streak of arrogance I carried like a badge. So when my friend Nathan dared me to drive the red road at midnight, I didn't just say yes, I said I'd park and sit with the lights off until something happened. Nathan was the kind who thrived on stories but didn't believe them either. He said if we saw something, it would probably be a couple of good old boys playing dress-up to scare teenagers. Still, when the night came, I could tell by the way he kept tapping his fingers on his knee that he wasn't as steady as he wanted me to think. The road was darker than I expected. Out there, the stars swallowed most of the sky, and the scrub brush rose in black shapes that seemed to lean closer the farther we drove. The soil had that strange burnt red look even under the headlights, and it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. When we stopped, I killed the engine, and suddenly it was just crickets and the occasional bark of a far-off dog. Nathan gave a nervous laugh and said, "Well, this is exciting." I didn't answer because I was staring down the road, waiting. The air smelled metallic like wet iron, and I couldn't shake the thought that it was the ground breathing out old blood. We waited 15 minutes, then 30. Nathan cracked jokes to fill the silence, but every sound carried too far. The slam of a soda can opening made both of us jolt. The brush on the left rustled once, then went still. When I glanced at Nathan, I could see sweat shining on his forehead even though the air had cooled down enough to raise goose flesh on my arms. That's when the horses came. They didn't appear gradually, not like real animals would. 1 second the road was empty, the next it was filled with movement, shadows galloping hard down both sides of the dirt path. I couldn't hear them, but I felt the ground vibrating like distant thunder. The headlights should have cut across them, but they didn't seem to catch the light the way flesh and blood should. They flickered like they were half here and half not. The riders' shirts were shredded, chests torn wide with black holes rimmed in glistening red. Some had their jaws hanging at odd angles, their faces slack as if death had stolen the muscle but left the rage. The closer they came, the more details I saw that froze the blood in my veins. Spurs that dug into horse flanks but left no sound. Revolvers clutched in hands that looked stiff with rigor. Blood dripping but never hitting the dirt, Nathan whispered. Jesus Christ. He reached for the ignition, but his hand froze like he was afraid to move too fast. I couldn't stop staring at one of them, a rider with a wide-brimmed hat half blown off his head. His face was split by a gunshot that had torn away his cheek, teeth glistening in the wound. His eyes locked on mine, and I swear for a moment, I could feel him inside my head. It wasn't like seeing an animal look your way. It was a hateful recognition, as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting for me. Then they passed, the whole pack surging forward in unison, blood glistening, bodies jerking with phantom impact. They galloped past the car, then vanished into the scrub just like my father said. No sound, no dust kicked up, no sign they had ever been there. But the air was suddenly heavier, hot as if the night had drawn closer around us. Nathan slammed the keys and the car roared to life. We tore out of there, neither of us speaking until we hit the highway. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that rider's ruined face, that moment when his gaze cut into me like a blade. I tried to tell myself it was adrenaline, a trick of headlights and nerves, but deep down I knew better. That night something changed in me. It's been years since then. Nathan won't talk about it at all. He moved away, swore he'd never come back. But I still live here. And sometimes when the wind shifts and carries the smell of iron across the fields, I think about driving back out there. I tell myself it's curiosity, unfinished business. But there's something else too, something I don't say out loud. The red road feels like it's waiting, like it remembers me. And I'm starting to believe that those riders aren't just ghosts of the past. They're looking for someone to ride with them. Someone living. And the way that rider locked eyes with me, the way he seemed to know me, makes me wonder if I was already chosen. The road runs red for a reason. And one of these nights I think I'll hear the thunder of hooves outside my window. Silent but shaking the earth, calling me back to ride it forever. The town of Shafter sits out in the dry shoulder of West Texas, the kind of place where the desert presses close and the hills look like hunched shoulders of some old animal that died 100 years ago and was left to bleach. Most people only know it from a highway sign or a faded story about the silver mines that once pulled men underground, until the veins dried up. By the 1940s, the place was hollowing out, and by the time I first drove through in the 90s, it felt less like a town than a stubborn memory that refused to fade. You could still see the church, the little white schoolhouse, and the skeletal remnants of mining shafts yawning black against the hills. I stopped there because I've always been drawn to places like that, places where the air feels thick with things unsaid. But Shafter was different. Shafter had something watching. I parked my truck by the church and stepped out into the heavy silence. It was July, heat pressing down like a weight, but the air carried a strange chill when I walked toward the mines. They're fenced off, a warning sign hanging loose and unreadable in the sun, but everyone in Texas knows how weak fences are at keeping people out. I ducked through and started down a worn path leading to one of the old shafts. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the world around me was shrinking. The cicadas that had screamed by the church were gone here. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots scraping dirt and stone. That's when I felt it for the first time. The weight of something just behind me. Not footsteps, not even breath, just presence, like when you wake in the night certain someone is standing by your bed. I told myself it was nerves, the atmosphere getting under my skin. But I couldn't shake it. I turned more than once, each time expecting to see some drifter or maybe a curious local kid following me. Each time there was nothing, only the path stretching back toward the church and the fence. My throat dried in seconds. It felt like whatever it was didn't want me to see it. It wanted me to know it was there, but nothing more. A watcher. The mines loomed ahead, a black mouth cut into stone, shored up with old timber beams eaten by decades of sun and insects. As I stood at the threshold staring into that hollow dark, I thought I heard a shuffle, not from the shaft but behind me, right over my shoulder. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. Again, nothing. Empty air, sun-bleached earth. Yet the hair on my arms prickled like static. I told myself I'd only step in a few feet. Just a few, to feel the air, to look at the stone walls carved by hands long dead. But inside the shaft, the temperature dropped immediately. It wasn't the natural cool of shade. It was deeper, heavier, as if the ground itself exhaled a grave chill. My flashlight beam cut across graffiti, initials scratched into the wall, some of them going back decades. Then I heard it. A low scrape, as though someone dragged a boot heel across gravel. Behind me again. I swung the light, the beam shaking, with my hand and caught nothing but the tunnel stretching empty. That was when the stories I'd heard from locals rattled in my head, about the shadow that keeps its distance. Always just beyond the corner of your vision, always stepping where you just stepped. Miners whispered about it before the town dried up. A watcher in the mines. I told myself it was a story, but my body didn't believe it. I walked deeper, stupidly, every nerve screaming to turn back. The silence inside was suffocating. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and beneath it something else, something softer, like cloth brushing stone. The feeling of being shadowed grew stronger until it wasn't just behind me. It was around me, moving when I moved, pausing when I paused. I wanted to speak out loud, maybe say something like, "Who's there?" but my throat locked. Then my light flickered. Just once, a brief hiccup, but in that instant I swear I saw a shape. Not fully formed, but denser than the darkness, standing just at the edge of the beam. My gut twisted. I backed away, my shoulder hitting the damp wall. The air pressed tighter, like the tunnel itself wanted me inside. Wanted me trapped where the watcher could linger as long as it liked. That was when I ran. I stumbled out into the sun, gasping as if I'd surfaced from underwater. My truck sat down by the church like a lifeline. The strange thing was, even in the daylight, even with open sky above, I could still feel it. That quiet presence a few steps behind. The watcher doesn't belong only to the dark. It followed me across the fence up the path to the church. When I slid into my truck, shaking, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something had leaned close to the glass, watching from inside with me. I drove away without looking back. But in the weeks that followed, I started catching it elsewhere, walking my own hallway at home and feeling a second rhythm behind me, sitting in a diner and sensing someone in the booth just out of sight. Always there, never seen. Shafter is nearly a ghost now, just a few houses, just a few souls who don't leave. Ask them and they'll tell you the watcher isn't cruel, it doesn't strike. It only observes, like a shadow with patience older than the hills. But when you feel it, when you know it has fixed on you, the cruelest part is the not knowing. You don't know when it began, and you sure as hell don't know if it ever ends. Maybe it just waits for you to slow down, to grow too tired to keep moving. Maybe it waits until the day you finally stop turning your head to check, the day you accept it. That's when, they say, it finally steps into sight. And by then, you're already too far from help. I don't go back to Shafter anymore. But the truth is, I don't need to. Because no matter how far I drive, no matter where I sleep, I still feel it. Tonight, I can feel it now. Just beyond the glow of this screen. A weight in the room. A shadow keeping still but never leaving. Watching. Helena, Texas was one of those towns people whispered about but never lingered in. It sat alone on the stretch of dry highway between San Antonio and Goliad, a place half swallowed by mesquite and prickly pear, with weathered wooden storefronts leaning like tired old men in the sun. The town had once been proud of its reputation as the meanest town in Texas, a badge earned not through law, but through blood. Gunfights, hangings, and drunken knife duels had stained its soil so many times that even cattle drivers avoided stopping there if they could. But Helena's worst stories always circled back to the saloon. Locals claimed its walls still wept blood, phantom stains trickling down the planks where countless men had died. I came to Helena out of curiosity, chasing Texas ghost stories for a little project I'd started. I wasn't a believer in the supernatural, at least not in the way Hollywood sells it, but I had an itch for dark places, spots history had forgotten or twisted. Helena wasn't hard to find. You pulled off Highway 80, rolled down a cracked county road, and before long you saw the cluster of crumbling buildings with roofs sagging like broken backs. The sun was low when I arrived, throwing long shadows across the dirt street. The air smelled dry, like dust and iron, and it was so quiet I could hear the faint buzzing of cicadas even though autumn had already thinned them out. The saloon sat right in the middle of town, the largest building by far. Its double doors were barely hanging on, and one window had been patched with a sheet of tin nailed haphazardly across the frame. The sign above the entrance still faintly read, "The Helena House," in faded paint. I stepped inside with my flashlight, though enough daylight still slipped through the cracks in the walls to paint the room in streaks of pale gold. The bar stretched across one side, warped with time, and broken tables lay scattered like bones on the floor. There were bullet holes in the wood, not one or two, but dozens, clustered in little bursts where men must have unloaded pistols at close range. The strangest thing, though, was the dark streaking along the back wall. At first glance, I thought it was water damage, but as I got closer, the stains looked too dark, too rich, as if someone had thrown buckets of old blood that never quite dried. I had read stories about this place, how men used to boast they'd painted the walls with enemies, but I thought it was folklore. Then, while I was studying the streaks, my flashlight beam caught something that made my skin crawl. A bead of red, wet and gleaming, slowly slid down the wall. I froze. It wasn't dust or trick of light. The liquid was thick, clinging to the plank before dripping down. I reached out instinctively, then yanked my hand back, disgusted with myself. I swore I smelled copper, sharp and metallic, like blood fresh from a cut. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was rust, maybe moisture pulling old tannins from the wood. But the building was bone dry. The air itself felt desiccated. Yet here it was, a droplet of crimson sliding like the wall itself was bleeding. I stepped back, heart thumping. That was when I heard the sound. Not loud, not obvious, but clear enough to raise every hair on my neck. It was laughter. Dry, low, like men chuckling over whiskey. The kind of sound you hear in a bar before a fight breaks out. I swung the flashlight across the room, but it was empty. Only overturned chairs and shadows. Still, the sound seemed to thrum against the wood, vibrating faintly in the air like memory replaying itself in the planks. I backed toward the doors, but they slammed shut before I reached them, the bang echoing so hard dust fell from the rafters. My flashlight flickered, and I swore I saw figures for a fraction of a second. Men leaning against the bar, hats pulled low, pistols on their hips. A woman in a torn red dress sitting at a table, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, all gone when the beam steadied. I pressed my back to the wall and held my breath. The laughter shifted to voices overlapping, angry, half-shouted like arguments before violence. One barked out, "String him up!" Another snarled something about cheating cards. Then a scream cut through, raw and human, before it was muffled into silence. The walls shuddered faintly, and I watched more streaks begin to drip. They weren't just bleeding now, they were weeping. Rivulets running down like rain, but thicker, darker. The air filled with the stench of iron so strong I gagged. My head swam with the heat and the smell, and I pressed a sleeve over my nose. When I looked again, I saw handprints smeared across the walls as if someone had clawed at them. Desperate to escape, fingers dragged crimson trails down the wood that hadn't been there before. I tried the doors again, and this time they gave way, nearly throwing me into the street. The daylight outside looked blinding, unreal after the suffocating dark. I stumbled across the dirt road, bent double, trying to steady my breathing. The town was silent again. The air outside smelled normal, of mesquite and dust, not blood. But when I looked back at the saloon, I saw something that made my throat close. One of the windows, grimy and cracked, was streaked red from the inside, thick as if someone had pressed a bleeding face against it. And in the glass I thought I saw eyes staring, not human exactly, but glinting, sharp as a predator's. I didn't stay the night in Helena. I drove until I hit Goliad and sat in a diner for hours, drinking coffee and trying to scrub the smell of iron from my nose. The waitress asked if I was sick because I looked pale, and I almost laughed because how could I explain? To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, or if Helena's history just pressed so hard into my mind that I hallucinated. But sometimes I wake in the night and smell blood in the air, faint but undeniable. I see walls in my dreams, bleeding and streaked with handprints that slide down toward the floor. And always in the corner I hear that laughter. The mean, cruel laughter of men who never left Helena, who stained the wood with blood and made sure it would never dry. The highway stretched flat and merciless under the late summer sky, a bleached ribbon cutting through the nothingness of West Texas. The town of Stiles, or what was left of it, lay another hour north, but even from miles away you could feel the absence pressing in, like the land itself remembered being abandoned. There wasn't much to Stiles anymore, just sun-rotted foundations, a few scattered chimneys pointing like fingers toward the heavens, and stories whispered in gas stations along Highway 67. Stories about a church that shouldn't be there. A church that glowed at night and welcomed travelers into something far older than its crumbling stone walls suggested. Nobody could ever find it by day. Nobody ever reached it by night. I didn't believe in ghost stories, not then anyway. I was driving out from Odessa after a job ended early, cutting through the desert because I hated the endless monotony of I-20. It was near midnight when my headlights first picked it out. At first I thought it was some local's house lit up for a gathering, maybe a wedding reception or something. But as I got closer I realized it wasn't a house at all. It was a chapel, standing proud in the desert where nothing else lived, the windows spilling warm golden light out across the dirt and scrub. It looked like something from a dream, too perfect, too untouched by time. The cross on top seemed to hum with its own glow, and the longer I looked, the less my high beam seemed necessary. The night had its own illumination now, I slowed the truck and pulled to the side, staring. My map app showed nothing but blank desert. No roads, no buildings, no towns. Just the long stretch of 67. But the church was there, plain as day. I killed the engine and stepped out. The desert air heavy with that strange silence you only hear in places that have forgotten people. From inside the chapel, I thought I heard voices. Soft, melodic, like a hymn sung in an old tongue I couldn't place. It tugged at me, the way music from childhood might. Something deep in the blood pulling you closer. My boots crunched on gravel as I started walking toward it. I must have crossed half a mile of scrub, though it never looked more than a few hundred yards away. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. The closer I thought I got, the farther it stretched from me. The glow never dimmed, never wavered, just shifted across the horizon like a mirage. But I swear to God I could smell incense now, thick and choking, and the faintest breath of candle wax melting. My skin prickled, my throat tightening. The hymns rose higher, more voices joining, layered in harmony that seemed too precise for human mouths. It was beautiful, but it made my stomach twist. I tried to run, desperate to close the distance. That was when the ground shifted. The desert sand seemed to ripple under my boots, swallowing them deeper than it should. My legs felt leaden, heavy as if I'd stepped into a bog instead of dry land. The chapel loomed just ahead, the doors yawning open, light spilling like blood from a wound. And then, nothing. I blinked and the desert was empty. Black night. No glow, no voices, no church. Just me standing stupid in the silence, sweat cold on my skin. I stumbled back to the truck, convinced I'd gone half mad from the heat. My phone said it was 2:14 a.m., though I swore I'd only left the cab half an hour before. I drove on, refusing to look back, but the rest of the night the smell clung to me, sweet and suffocating, as though I'd walked through clouds of it. Weeks later, I mentioned it at a bar in San Angelo, half joking, half hoping someone else had seen it. The bartender froze, beer halfway to the counter. A man at the far end of the bar, weathered face carved deep by desert sun, turned slow and fixed me with the kind of look that makes your blood chill. "You don't talk about that place," he said. His voice cracked like dry wood. "You don't follow it when it calls." He told me his grandfather had been sheriff of Reagan County when Stiles was still alive. Back in the 1920s, the town had boomed with oil money, people flocking in like flies. They'd built a church then, the finest in West Texas, but the preacher they brought with him wasn't right. Folks whispered he'd been run out of 2 towns before, that he spoke more Latin than scripture, and that sometimes the hymns sounded more like invocations. It didn't take long before people started vanishing, men, women, even kids, always at night, always last seen walking toward the chapel when its windows burned brighter than lanterns. Then the sheriff himself went missing, and that was the end of it. The town emptied, businesses shuttered, the desert reclaiming what was left. But travelers still spoke of the glowing church that rose up out of nowhere, promising sanctuary. None who entered were ever seen again. I wanted to dismiss it, laugh it off as another small-town ghost tale, but I couldn't forget how real it looked, how close I'd come to stepping through those doors. Every time I close my eyes, I still see that golden light searing the dark, and I hear the choir swell until it drowns out thought. It waits on that highway still, drawing the weary and the lost. Some nights, if the air is dry enough and the desert holds its breath, you can see it shining against the horizon like a promise you should never keep. And if you're ever unlucky enough to smell incense on the wind when there's nothing but sand around you, turn away, no matter how sweet it seems, because the phantom church of Stiles will call your name, and once you answer, there's no coming back. Weedhaven sat out near the eastern stretch of the Texas plains, not far from the Sabine, but far enough that the only travelers who ever stumbled across it were campers, drifters, or those who missed a turn and drove a little too deep into the back roads where the pines grew thick, and the asphalt gave way to cracked gravel. It hadn't been a living town in decades. A handful of roofless houses sagged along a dirt road that no one maintained anymore, and a toppled water tower rusted into the weeds like a dying animal. People said the storm that finally finished Weedhaven came through in '79, a tornado that screamed like the devil himself as it tore through clapboard houses and slammed entire families into the earth. But no one ever came back to clear it, and no one claimed the dead. Whatever happened that night seemed to nail the town shut forever, as though nature itself had made it a grave. Yet campers still came, not many but enough. The kind of people looking for cheap thrills or the kind who wanted to test out campfire legends with a six-pack and a flashlight. Some didn't stay long. Those who left usually did it in the middle of the night, their tents still flapping in the wind, their coolers forgotten by the fire pit. They never wanted to explain exactly why, but when they did talk, the words were always the same. The wind didn't sound right. It had a voice. That was the legend anyway. Folks in the closest town over, Newton or Shelbyville, depending which direction you came from, told stories about how Weedhaven had been built wrong from the start, laid on soil that still carried graves from a fever epidemic in the 1800s, graves that were never properly marked or blessed. The tornado didn't just destroy Weedhaven, they said. It set loose what had been buried beneath. When the gusts funneled through the collapsed houses, the sound wasn't just air, it was screaming. Like men with crushed ribs, like women crying through broken jaws, like dying throats howling as the timbers split around them. People laughed at it during the day, pointing out how wood and nails made strange whistles when bent by wind. But no one laughed at night when those same gusts shot through the ruins with the pitch of a throat being slit. Mark Collins wasn't the type to believe in stories. He was a Houston kid who had grown up around gunfire in the streets, the real kind of horror that left bodies in parking lots, not some backwoods superstition about a town no one remembered. When his friends suggested camping at Weedhaven, he didn't hesitate. In fact, he was the one who pushed hardest. It wasn't about ghost stories for him. It was about proving he wasn't scared. They piled into his buddy Joel's truck, 4 of them, the cooler sloshing with cheap beer, the tent wedged awkwardly between the cab and the bed. By the time they reached the ruins, the sun was down and the air already had that heavy, restless feel of an unsettled storm. The last orange light of the sky caught on the frame of a house with no roof, its chimney jutting upward like a snapped bone. Weedhaven was darker than the woods around it, as though shadows had soaked into the wood and refused to leave. Joel parked the truck near what had once been a church. Its steeple was gone, but the cross remained, bent sideways into the dirt. They set up camp right there, laughing too loud, their voices bouncing off the ruins. It was fine at first. They passed beers, told crude stories, and dared each other to wander into the husks of houses with nothing but a flashlight. The town seemed hollow, the kind of place where even their laughter felt swallowed before it could echo. Then the wind came. It started as a low push through the trees, rattling pine needles and tugging at the fire, but as it slid into the town proper, it changed. Joel was the first to notice. He tilted his head like a dog and frowned, the firelight playing against his face. "You hear that?" he asked. Mark laughed, said it was just wind. But then Ashley, the only girl with them, leaned in closer to the fire and pulled her blanket tighter. It didn't sound like wind. Not anymore. It rose from the gaps in the walls, squeezed through shattered windows and whistled against the broken chimneys with a pitch too sharp, too raw. It swelled until it became the kind of sound that made your skin crawl before your brain caught up. It was screaming. Not human words, but pain made into sound, like a crowd of throats being dragged into the air at once. Mark tried to brush it off, but the laughter died. No one could keep it going when the air itself sounded like a man drowning in his own blood. The fire bent hard to one side and threw sparks. Somewhere in the ruins, a shutterless window slammed even though no one had touched it in years. The shriek rolled through it like a dying animal. Joel cursed and grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the black gaps of the houses. For a second, the light seemed to catch something. A shape against a wall, too tall to be a person, too stretched, like cloth being pulled taut in the wind. Then it vanished as quickly as the beam moved. Mark swore it was just dust and shadow, but even he didn't believe it. The sound rose again, sharper now, and one of the beams above the old church groaned like it was being pushed by invisible hands. Ashley wanted to leave. She was pale, clutching her blanket like it could protect her. Joel hesitated, muttering about how it was just the wind, but his voice cracked. Mark didn't want to back down. He said it would pass, storms always passed, and if they left now, they'd look like cowards. But even as he said it, something in him knew he was wrong. The wind wasn't moving on. It was circling. It whipped harder, rushing through the bones of Weedhaven until every collapsed house became a throat and every throat screamed. The sound blended, a choir of agony, each pitch bending and twisting until it was almost words. Mark thought he heard his own name. Then he thought he heard a plea, a begging voice buried in the roar calling for help. But it was impossible. No one lived here. No one human anyway. The fire went out with a final hiss, leaving only the flashlights weak and jerking in the gusts. Then the voices seemed to grow closer, like the screaming was no longer inside the ruins but moving toward them, pulled on the breath of the wind itself. Joel cursed and threw the cooler back into the truck bed, slamming the tailgate. Ashley was already inside, shaking and crying. Mark hesitated only a second before grabbing the tent by its frame and yanking it down, not caring if it tore. The wind shrieked harder, and in it he swore he heard laughter. Not human laughter, but the sound wood makes when it splits under pressure, sharpened and bent until it became cruel. As they roared down the gravel road, the ruins disappeared behind them, but the screaming didn't. It chased them through the trees, whipping through the pines, crushing against the bed of the truck like hands scraping the metal. Only when they reached the paved highway did it stop, cut off mid-wail as though a door had slammed on it. They didn't speak until they hit the outskirts of Newton, and even then it was only to swear they'd never talk about it again. But Mark couldn't forget. He thought he saw something in the rear view that night. Just as the last scream cut out, something tall rising in the road behind them, its edges shredding in the wind like cloth, its mouth wide open though no face sat above it. He didn't tell the others. He couldn't. But he knew that whatever haunted Weedhaven wasn't the dead screaming. It was something older, something that had waited for the right storm to tear the town open and give it a voice. And now every time the wind rose outside his apartment window, he froze, listening. Because sometimes, just faint enough to question, he swore he still heard it calling his name. When people talk about Proctor, Texas, they don't usually mean the town itself. They mean the reservoir that swallowed most of it back in the 70s. A man-made lake meant to quench parched fields and cool summer families in their boats. What remains of the town lies quiet on the edges. A gas station that never quite shuts down, a boarded grocery with its sign rusted beyond recognition, and a string of houses that look like they were abandoned in a hurry. Windows smashed, porches sagging, roofs caved in like old lungs giving way. Nobody much bothers to go poking around there anymore. Not since the story started. But I did, because I wanted to see for myself if there was anything to the rumors about the knocks. The story said that just after sunset, when the shadow stretched long across the dirt lots and the cicadas gave up their buzzing, you'd hear someone rapping from inside those dead houses. Not hard like a fist, not light like a branch tapping, but steady, deliberate, like a child at a door who won't give up until you let them in. I had been staying with my cousin in Dublin, 20 minutes down the road, and he warned me about going out to Proctor at night. He said it in that low voice men use when they don't want to sound afraid but still can't quite keep the unease out of their throats. He told me he had driven past once at dusk, heading back from the lake, and his headlights caught figures standing in one of the yards. Small figures, still as fence posts. He swore they were children, pale as candle wax, just watching his truck crawl past, and he floored it without looking back. He tried to make it sound like a joke afterward, but his hands wouldn't quit drumming the steering wheel when he told me. That was enough to set a hook in my mind. I had to see it. Some things just gnaw at you until you go and look. So one evening I drove out there just before the sun began to sink. The road was cracked and forgotten, weeds curling up through fissures, and the air smelled like warm dust and algae drifting from the lake. I parked by the skeleton of what must have been a feed store and walked down the lane where the houses sat like broken teeth. The silence was strange. You expect wind, dogs, something, but all I could hear was the faint creak of my boots on the gravel and the distant slap of water against stone. The first house I approached had its door hanging sideways, and when I peered inside it smelled of mold and mice. There were scraps of wallpaper curling off, a child's shoe half buried in dust. My heart was already beating faster, but not from fear, not yet. More like anticipation. The knocking came about 15 minutes later. I had wandered 3 houses down, standing by a porch where the railing had collapsed. It was faint at first, easy to mistake for wood settling, but then it came again, clear and sharp, 3 knocks in quick succession. They came from inside the house across the street, the one with boarded windows and a roofline canted like it was bowing. My mouth went dry. It was too precise, too human. I told myself maybe an animal had gotten stuck in there pawing at something, but the rhythm was wrong. It was a knock, then silence, then another set, softer, like whoever was inside was trying to be polite, patient. I stood frozen, listening until the cicadas cut off all at once and the dusk settled heavy as a lid. That was when I saw them. Two figures stepping out from behind the corner of the house with the boarded windows. At first I thought they were teenagers, maybe locals trying to scare trespassers. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were too small, too slight. Children, yes, but not right. Their skin was pale, gray almost, and their clothes were strange, old-fashioned, hanging loose on them. They stopped at the edge of the yard and looked straight at me. That was when I saw their eyes. Black, nothing else, like someone had scooped them out and filled the sockets with tar. My stomach dropped. I couldn't move. One of them tilted their head, and though their lips didn't part, I heard a voice as clear as if it were spoken right next to me. It asked if they could come inside. My throat tightened because there was no house behind me, no door to open. They were asking something else. I turned then and my boot slipped in the gravel, but I managed to run. My truck was maybe 100 yards back, and each step felt like my legs were fighting me. Behind me I heard footsteps, light pattering, not rushing, just following. I didn't dare look, but I knew they were closer than they should have been. I reached my truck, yanked the door, and as I slammed it shut, I finally looked through the windshield. They were standing in the middle of the road, side by side, their faces blank, their black eyes fixed on me. One raised its hand and knocked, though there was no door between us, just the air and the glass. The sound was loud, impossibly loud, right there in the cab. I shoved the keys in, turned the ignition, and peeled away, gravel spraying. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then I drove another 10 miles before I pulled over and sat with my hands shaking on the wheel. I told myself later it had to be some trick of the mind, shadows playing with me, the silence and the emptiness getting in my head. But then I started hearing things at night back at my cousin's place. A knock at the window, faint just after dusk, always 3 times, always polite. He asked me once why I looked so tired, and I couldn't tell him the truth, that I was too afraid to turn off the lights after dark. One night, when I finally gathered the nerve to look, I saw 2 small shapes standing by the mesquite tree in the yard. Just watching, waiting. I don't go near Proctor anymore. I don't even drive past the signs pointing toward it. But I know this much: the houses aren't really abandoned. Something lives in them, something wearing the shape of children, something that waits for someone foolish enough to answer the knock. And once you see them, once they know you've noticed, they don't let go. They find you, and sooner or later you will have to answer. Medicine Mound is a place most Texans drive past without a second thought. It sits out on the flat scrubland between Quanah and Chillicothe. 4 low hills rising strangely from the prairie, like the backs of animals too tired to move. The town, that once shared the name, is nothing now but crumbling stone walls, half-buried foundations, and a schoolhouse leaning against the wind like a drunk who lost his footing years ago and never straightened up again. Old-timers talk about it, but only in the way you'd mention a scar, quick and without detail, as though the longer you lingered, the more it might ache. I came there in early October, when the cotton fields were pale and dry, stretched in all directions like brittle paper. I was chasing stories, digging into ghost towns and forgotten corners of Texas, writing articles that no one but the desperate or the lonely ever clicked on. But Medicine Mound had a peculiar reputation. People said if you walked the ruins alone, you'd hear someone trailing you. Not coyotes in the brush, not the scuff of your own boots echoed by the wind, but footsteps in perfect rhythm, always a few paces behind. Some claimed they'd felt breath on the back of their neck, or the tug of unseen fingers brushing their shirt sleeve. A few swore they'd fled, and the steps chased them, growing quicker, sharper, closing in until they reached their truck. Then silence. I arrived at dusk, which was either my first mistake or the only way to do it properly. The sun was collapsing into the west, bleeding out in streaks of purple and rust, and the 4 mounds stood silhouetted like watchmen. I parked my truck on the gravel shoulder, crunching across weeds and bits of glass toward the skeleton of the old schoolhouse. Its roof had caved years ago, and the windows were nothing but frames around emptiness. Graffiti scrawled the bricks, names and curses, sometimes layered so thick they looked like scars carved over scars. I told myself I'd walk slow, take notes, and keep my phone recording in my pocket. My boots stirred dust and grasshoppers as I moved deeper into what had been the town. The air was so still it felt brittle, the kind that makes sound carry unnaturally far. When I stopped to take a photo, the silence pressed against me until I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then I moved on, crunching gravel, And it happened. A step behind me. Not the echo of my own. Not the shift of dirt settling after my weight. A distinct, delayed crunch softer than mine, but sharp enough to freeze me. I turned, but the path was empty. The schoolhouse loomed 10 yards back, its black windows hollow as sockets. I waited, phone clutched in my pocket, holding my breath. Nothing. So I walked again, slow, deliberate, toward a collapsed stone storefront where weeds grew from the counter. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Then it came again. Crunch. Crunch. Always behind me, never overlapping, always just far enough that if it were a person, they would be trailing at the edge of reach. I spun fast this time, and the sensation was so clear I half expected to collide with someone. But again, nothing. The weeds rustled faintly in the breeze that wasn't there. A sensible man would have left then. I told myself I was a writer, and a writer needs proof. I raised my phone, started recording video, and kept walking toward the mounds. The prairie stretched around me, flat and endless, the sky going black except for the last ash of red at the horizon. The footsteps grew bolder as I walked. No longer a single crunch every few seconds, but steady, a rhythm that matched mine. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped. My throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, and sweat prickled the back of my neck even as the air chilled. At one point, I whispered, "Hello?" The sound startled me, too loud against the stillness. The steps answered. Not with a voice, not with any break in the pattern, but with 2 hard crunches close enough that my nerves screamed to run. I forced myself to stand my ground. The phone in my hand was shaking, and when I lifted it to glance at the screen, the camera showed only grainy darkness and the faint outline of my boots. I turned it behind me. Nothing but weeds and the shadow of the schoolhouse. I moved again, faster now, heart slamming. The steps chased me, closing distance. I could hear them clearly, as though boots struck right on my heels. I broke into a run, my breath loud, gravel spraying from under me, and for a terrifying second the steps doubled, tripled like a crowd chasing me down an alley. I didn't look back until I reached my truck, yanking the handle and throwing myself inside. I slammed the lock and sat panting, staring through the windshield at the ruins. The night was complete now, the mounds hulking black against the stars. No one stood on the path, nothing moved, but the sound didn't stop. It circled the truck, crunching slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just out of the headlights. I gripped the wheel, frozen, too afraid to start the engine in case the noise drowned what I was hearing. The steps came closer on the driver's side, paused inches from my door. Then knuckles rapped the glass. I screamed, fumbling the key into the ignition, flooring the accelerator. Gravel sprayed as I tore back onto the highway, headlights sweeping over the ruins. For the barest flicker, I thought I saw a figure standing in front of the schoolhouse, tall, thin, its head tilted like it was listening. But when I blinked, there was only darkness. Back in town, I pulled over at a gas station, shaking so badly I had to sit with the truck idling for 20 minutes. When I finally checked my phone, the video was there, a 3-minute clip. It showed nothing but the dark road and the outline of my boots. But the sound was clear. Footsteps, pacing me perfectly. I deleted it before I could change my mind. Some stories don't need proof. They don't want it. And sometimes when I walk home late at night down the quiet street behind my house, I swear I hear it again. 1 step after mine, never ahead, always behind, always patient. As though whatever walks the ruins of Medicine Mound isn't bound to the prairie at all, but to anyone foolish enough to listen. The desert around Candelaria is not a place where sound should linger. The wind comes and goes like a thief, carrying grit and heat across the scrub and broken ground, and when it dies, the silence is so complete, it presses against your ears. The old mining town is nothing now but a cluster of collapsed roofs, walls half buried in sand, and a schoolyard where rust has eaten the bones of what children once played on. The swing set is the most intact thing left. 2 A-frames leaning stubbornly in the dirt, its chains red with corrosion, the seats warped from decades of sun. The wind doesn't move it anymore. The desert air is too still, too heavy, but the swing creaks back and forth in its own rhythm. People who've passed through swear they saw it move when no breeze touched it, and more than one has said they heard footsteps crunching behind them when they turned to look. Nothing but the hot emptiness staring back. Danny Mendez was not the kind of man who believed in such talk. He drove freight runs down to Presidio, hauling across the lonely miles of Highway 170, and he sometimes cut through Candelaria when he wanted to shave time. It was quicker to veer off, let his rig crawl through that hushed skeleton of a town, than to stay on the main stretch with Border Patrol checkpoints and random delays. He'd seen the swing before, but only out of the corner of his eye like a mirage baked into the ruins. This time, though, he stopped. His radiator had been spitting steam an hour back, and when he pulled into the dust-choked square, he killed the engine and listened to the tick of hot metal cooling. He got out, stretched his back, and noticed the swing was moving. A slow sway like a mother's hand was pushing it. He glanced at the mesquite trees in the brush, waiting for the gust that never came. He told himself it was the heat. Heat could bend your vision, mess with your senses. He left the cab door open and walked toward the swing. The ground gave beneath his boots, dry crust breaking to powder, and the silence was immense. No cicadas, no coyotes, no distant truck engines. Just the scrape of his own soles and the faint metallic whine of chain links grinding. He stopped short of touching it. The seat swayed, a little sharper now, as if whoever was pushing had grown impatient. Danny stared at the sand underneath. No tracks. He felt a muscle twitch in his neck. He backed away, but the sound followed him. The squeak of the swing seemed to echo in his ears, too close. He turned, saw the swing still in motion, but now another sound rose with it, faint at first, then clearer. Footsteps. They were soft, dragging, as if bare feet were moving across the powdery ground behind him. He whipped around. Nothing. Just sun-bleached wood, leaning stone, and the flat glare of the desert stretching toward Mexico. He stood frozen, waiting for the noise to repeat, and it did. Closer this time, deliberate. He muttered a curse, went back to his truck, and slammed the door. The cab felt like an oven, but it was safer than being outside. He cranked the ignition, listening for the engine to turn over. It coughed, stuttered, and died. He hit the wheel with his palm, swore again, and glanced up. The swing was still moving, but something had changed. The second swing, the one that had hung stiff and useless all these years, now creaked too. Both were in motion, back and forth, steady and in sync, as if two unseen children pumped their legs to rise higher. The sound of their chains rattling scraped through the heat. Danny grabbed the radio. Static answered him. No dispatcher voice, no hiss of a channel clearing. He clicked the mic again and again until his thumb hurt. But the only sound was the rising squeal of those swings. He felt something then, a pressure in the cab, as if someone had climbed into the seat beside him, though the cushion sagged empty. The smell hit next, faint but cutting through the sweat and gasoline. Old iron, metallic and sour like rusted blood. He jerked his head toward the passenger seat and swore he saw the fabric crease, the imprint of weight settling. He slammed out of the cab before he thought about it. The air outside seemed thicker, harder to breathe. His skin prickled. The swings now moved violently, arcing high as if whoever pushed them was in frenzy. The sound filled the whole square, chains groaning, metal whining. Then over it, laughter, thin, sharp, childish. It didn't come from the swings. It came from behind him. He turned and caught sight of a small figure darting between the shells of the houses, pale arms flashing in the light, hair like a dark tangle. He ran toward it before his brain stopped him, calling out, but the figure slipped behind a collapsed wall. When he rounded the corner, there was nothing but a lizard skittering across stone. He stood panting, sweat dripping into his eyes, the laughter still echoing somewhere. The swings shrieked behind him. Then quieter now, but far closer. The sound of feet padding in sand. A small hand brushed against his, cold as metal in shade. He tore his hand back, stumbled, and fell against the ruin of a porch beam. The air in front of him shimmered. A shape flickered, not solid, but enough to suggest. Two children, skin blistered by sun and stripped raw by something harsher, their eyes hollow and dark. Their mouths moved, but the laughter didn't match, as if the sound came from somewhere else, some hole in the earth opening wide. He scrambled backward, heart hammering until his back hit the side of his truck. The children dissolved in the heat, gone in a blink. The swings slowed, their squeals softening to faint whimpers. Danny yanked the door open and tried the ignition again. This time it caught, engine roaring, and he floored it, wheels spitting dust. He didn't look back until the road curved away from the ruins, and when he did, the swings were still in motion. Though no one touched them, though the desert was dead still, not a breath of air. Danny never drove that way again, but word spread, as word does in places where the living keep their distance from the dead. Candelaria became a mark on certain maps passed around in bars, whispered about at border checkpoints, a place daring enough men would try to see for themselves. Most found nothing but silence and heat. A few came back with stories of footsteps dogging them, laughter behind their ears, or the sight of the swings rocking to their own rhythm. And one or two never came back at all. Their trucks found empty by the roadside, doors hanging open, engines still ticking warm. The desert has a way of burying its secrets, but not all of them stay buried. Some linger, creaking on rusted chains, waiting for someone foolish enough to stop and listen. The dormitory at Belle Plaine College had been empty for decades, its limestone walls stained dark with age, and its wooden beams sagging like tired shoulders. The whole campus was abandoned after the school closed in the 1960s, but the old dorm, the three-story hulk at the edge of the grounds, carried the heaviest whispers. People said it was the only building that didn't crumble. Its windows still stood like glass eyes, unbroken by rock-throwing kids or storms that tore roofs from barns all over Callahan County. That in itself was strange. Stranger still was what locals swore they saw when they drove past after midnight, a glow pale as a candle flame, burning in the corner window on the top floor. And always, if you looked long enough, a man's shape in the glass, not moving, not leaving, not even blinking, just staring back, though no one had a key to the place and no power had run through the wires for half a century. A gas station clerk named Jimmy Whitaker saw it first, back in '78 when he drove home after closing up at 2 a.m. He claimed the figure wore a suit neat as Sunday clothes, though the collar was shadow dark as if wet. Jimmy nearly wrecked his truck trying to look and drive at the same time. He never passed that road again at night, swore the thing in the window tilted its head to follow him. Over the years, kids dared each other to drive past. Some swore they saw nothing, others said they saw the same man Jimmy described, and a few said worse. That he raised his hand slowly as if beckoning, that when the glass reflected headlights, the eyes in the window glowed red for just an instant. Those kids never lingered. They tore off, gravel spitting from their tires. And yet the window glowed again the next night and the next. In the late 90s, a group of college students from Abilene Christian tried to stay the night inside the dorm for a documentary project. They hauled cameras, lanterns, sleeping bags, and all the bravado of 19-year-olds. Only 2 came out by dawn. They were found on the roadside, barefoot, clutching each other like frightened children. They refused to speak about what they saw. The footage they shot was mostly static, streaked and ruined, except one fragment recovered later showing the top hall. A door opens by itself at the far end. A man in a suit steps halfway into the frame, then turns his head toward the camera. The film cuts out their screen tearing into gray snow. Neither survivor would admit who the man was or how he could have been there. As the years wore on, Belle Plaine College became a ruin tourists came to gawk at. The gym collapsed, the chapel roof caved in, but the dormitory remained weathered but whole, the window always untouched. Locals began calling it the last guest. Some claimed the man had been a student who hung himself in his room during finals. Others said he was a professor who disappeared after being accused of impropriety. No record supported either. County archives listed nothing but student rolls and faculty rosters, ordinary names, ordinary dates. Yet when archivists pulled the dorm's resident ledger for its last year, the entries stopped 1 page too soon. The last line was blank, as if someone had started writing a name then thought better of it. The ink was still faintly visible under the yellowed paper, but not enough to read. One October night not long ago, a trucker from Lubbock pulled over near Belle Plaine to sleep off fatigue. He told a waitress later that he parked in the shadow of the dorm, figuring the empty lot was quiet. Around midnight, he woke to tapping, steady and deliberate, like someone drumming long fingers against glass. He looked up through his windshield and saw the window lit with a cold glow. The figure stood there, head tilted, lips moving like he was speaking silently. The trucker swore he could almost hear the words, though the cab was sealed tight. He thought it was his name. He started his engine and roared away, but he claimed in the rear view the glow didn't fade. It followed him down the road, a bright square burning against the dark until he turned onto the highway. The man's shape stayed in the glass watching. Now nobody dares park within sight of the place. The college grounds are fenced off, patrolled by deputies who mostly just drink coffee and tell stories. But the dormitory keeps its own watch. Midnight after midnight, the window flares alive, no matter the season, no matter the storm. There is always a man there staring down at whoever passes. Some say he shifts sometimes, standing a little closer to the glass than he did the week before. Others swear the window is a little clearer now, that you can make out his eyes, his pale face, his wet collar. They say one day, he won't be behind the glass anymore. He'll be out in the lot waiting, patient as stone for the next traveler who lingers too long, who can't look away. And when that happens, they say the glow in the window will finally go dark, because the last guest of Belle Plaine College won't be in his room anymore. He'll be on the road searching for company. I was 20 when I first learned that a lake can have a smell like old cellars and peeled paint. It rises through the reeds after sundown along Lake Texoma, when the air goes flat and the bugs bump your ears. If the wind is right, you can stand on the cracked mud at Preston Bend and smell dust that has been wet for 60 years, a sourness of flooded wood, and the faint green bite of algae baking on stone. Folks in Pottsboro used to say that smell meant the water was turning over and the catfish would bite. My grandfather said something else. He said it was the breath of a town that had not decided whether it was dead. My grandfather's name was Webb, and he ran trot lines in a retired pontoon out of a little cove west of Preston Road. He kept a thermos of black coffee that tasted like a roofing nail soaked in rainwater, and he took people who wanted to see stripers where the Red River widened into Texas sky. He could tell you where the original town of Preston used to stand, back before the Corps came with their charts and said the river would wear the town apart if the floods did not. He could point out the line of darker water where a road ran straight out under the lake and ended at nothing. He did not much care for the story that a church steeple rose out there when the water got low. But every drought he would check the level marks on the Denison Dam and pretend to be surprised when the shape appeared, a slanted thing like a broken finger poking up through the heat shimmer. He would let the boat idle and listen to the clack of the engine cooling, and then he would say we ought to head back because storms can come up quick. The summer I am thinking of was a furnace. The grass went from green to the color of pennies. A hollow behind the bait shop breathed dust like a sleeping animal. My grandfather's hands, already cracked from decades of rope and scale, split and bled without him noticing. The lake fell. Someone with a drone filmed the steeple and got 1 million views. Teenagers drove out over the old bridge abutments that the water had left bare and drank warm beer on the concrete while the sun went down like a red eye. At night, coyotes trotted along the mud like chalk marks sliding over a blackboard. And there were whispers. Everyone said so. Not like voices you can follow, but a thin thing. A hushing that moved just under the wind, like a crowd at a funeral trying not to be rude. We laughed at it until we didn't. A striper guide named Reese said he heard a hymn he remembered from his mother. A game warden we all knew to be a practical man drove too fast through Pottsboro one night with his windows up and his hands at 10 and 2 like he was in driver's ed. When he stopped at the four-way, he kept his eyes on the red light and spoke in the voice you use to tell a dog to stay off the couch. The next day his patrol boat was seen drifting by the stumps at Hagerman, empty. They found him sitting on his dock with his boots on and his feet in the water, and he said he had dreamed the lake was inside the house and he had to wade through it to reach the fridge. My grandfather said maybe it was a brain fever. Then he stayed up 2 nights in a row staring at the cove. I had come back after college because something in me resisted the idea that my life would be model homes and office parks. I told myself I was helping out the old man and saving money. I told myself I would leave in the fall. In truth, I liked the way the lake changed mood every hour. I liked the weather radio clicking on with a monotone about thunderstorms that never came. I liked the way silence had weight. My girlfriend at the time said silence made her think about dying, and I said that seemed like a leap. She drove back to Dallas and I started walking alone down the exposed roads that used to be underwater, where the lake had pulled back like a curtain and showed what it had been hiding. There were foundations, spills of brick, a rectangle of steps that rose out of mud to a landing that led to no doorway. There was the rib cage of a pier and the jawbone of a culvert and the steeple, which we all pretended was just a spire from some small wood church, but didn't look like any church around here. Not with the long, narrow windows and the pointed top that had shed its white paint and gone the color of wet ashes. The Corps put up signs and then took them down because signs get in the way of grief. People came anyway and tied ribbons to mesquites as if a memorial could stick to a tree that had been drowned to the knuckles for most of its life. The town loved the attention and hated it. You could tell by how the clerk at Brookshire's asked every out-of-towner if they needed ice twice, once for being helpful and once to say we see you. A reporter came and interviewed my grandfather by the pontoon. She asked if he had lived here when they filled the lake. He was 30 then. He said, "No, ma'am, I lived here when they emptied it." At the bait shop, there was a wall of photographs that had been there since the 80s. Yellow at the corners, fish held out like the trophies they were. A new photograph appeared, pinned with a thumbtack near the register. It was black and white, or looked like it until you realized it was just bleached by sun. A congregation stood in front of a wooden church with a high, narrow steeple. The men wore wool suits, the women hats that could shelter a nest. A child sat on the steps and stared straight into the world beyond the camera. No one knew who had put the picture up. Everyone assumed someone else did. The child had a look that did not belong to any time. I thought it was a trick of the exposure. Later, when I was alone in there late at night, counting spinner baits and eating a bag of peanuts for dinner, I would swear his eyes had turned to follow me across the room. A week after the photograph appeared, my grandfather said he was going to take a run to the steeple at first light and see if he could put a line around it to give a clear boundary. The Corps had asked, and he liked to say yes to them because he did not like to say yes to many others. He told me to sleep, and I lay on the cot in the back room with the window open and the sound of bullfrogs like diesel engines idling, and I failed at sleep as a person fails at levitation. I got up before dawn and made coffee and waited for him on the dock. A mist had fallen onto the cove, a thin lid that made the boat look like a shadow. He came down in his old boots and climbed aboard and found the length of nylon rope he had coiled under the seat. He did not ask why I was there. I was always there when I said I would be. We pushed off and idled toward the line of darker water. Even in low water, the lake could be treacherous. There were galvanized T-posts that stuck up like exclamation points. There were trees that had learned to live underwater, and had not learned that air was not going to carry them now. So their trunks went slick and dangerous. There were holes in the clay where homes had been, and the wind worked at the edges until the ground became like pie crust. The steeple came into view with the slow dread of a memory you have kept in a box and opened once too often. It was taller than I remembered. That is not possible, but it was. The boat rocked with the bump of our own wake. The sky lit in strips like torn blue cloth. There was the smell of cellar doors and wet Bible leather. My grandfather throttled down and reached for the rope. There is a way that people in love or long marriages speak without speaking. They tip a chin or glance at a hand, and the other person already knows whether to pass the salt or call an ambulance. My grandfather and I were not that, but we had moved enough boats together to have a kind of choreography. I watched the way his shoulders pinched and knew he meant for me to slide up toward the bow and lean out with the boat hook. I did, and the hook clinked against the steeple, and that was the sound I remember most in this story. Not the whispers. Not the hymn. A simple metallic contact that told me this wood that looked like ash was banded with something under the grain. Something old iron black. I pulled it toward me and the boat swung and the lake spoke. You will say I was primed to hear it. That the reporter's questions and the teenagers and the drought and the discovery that the steeple had a spine of metal all conspired to make my brain throw a picture show on the underside of the morning. You can say that and I will not fight you. I am not a fighter. I heard a congregation. I heard the whispers under the wind go whole and take breath. A hymn rose, and I do not know what hymn it was because I did not grow up in church. But it had that shape, that slow, strong march, and the promise with teeth inside it. Words came up that were older than asphalt. My grandfather did not look at me. He had put the rope around the base of the steeple with the kind of knot a man uses when he does not know how to do anything better than keep things from drifting away. He said we should move on. His hands shook. The rope went taut. The boat drifted as if something were drawing us in. I pulled the hook back and let the steeple go. The sound died a little, like I had reached up and turned a knob on a radio. The worshippers were still there, all the voices, but they had closed their lips until the next verse. The wind rose as if to cover the gap in the music. I saw the child from the photograph sitting on those imagined steps, staring past the camera, and I knew, as surely as a man knows when a freckle is the wrong color, that the town was not content to live in pictures anymore. We moved the boat back into the channels we knew. My grandfather stowed the rope at his feet. When we were nearly to the cove, he said that the steeple was not supposed to be metal. I said maybe there was a bell frame. He said he knew enough about churches to know that a spire has wood bones. He did not say anything else until the day grew sharp with heat, and the skin on our forearms smelled like pennies again. He went inside and called the Corps and left a message that the area needed a larger perimeter. That was the last sensible thing he did for a while. By sundown, he had begun to make a list on a piece of yellow legal paper with that cramped handwriting that belongs to men who wore pocket protectors in high school. The list had dates. He wrote the year Preston's last preacher died. He wrote the year the railroad shifted its stop. He wrote the year the river cut south in a flood and a boy drowned trying to cross. The list grew, and I realized it was not a list of dates but a list of things taken. The preacher did not die, he was taken. The railroad did not shift, it took business. The river did not flood, it took breath. At the bottom of the list he wrote a name. It was my grandmother's, dead 10 years, kind as a cool hand on a forehead. He stared at the name and then went and sat on the dock with his boots on and his feet in the water. I did not pull him back. Part of me wanted to see what would happen if I let the lake do the talking. That night the wind had a way of moving that made the screen door tremble against its hook like a hand on a birdcage. I sat at the counter and looked at the photograph by the register. The child on the steps had become 2. I cannot make that statement gentle. There were now 2 children sitting side by side, one with the same hard stare, the other looking down as if ashamed of something that had not happened yet. Their clothes were wrong. I do not mean old-fashioned. I mean wrong in the way a shirt looks when you have put it on backward in the dark. The sleeves did not know where to end. I stepped closer and put my finger on the glass and felt the heat that photographs gather when you hang them in a shop that is open to August. I looked down to see if someone had switched the picture. The pin was the same. The corner was torn in the same place. I reached for the phone. The line was dead. I stood there and listened to the lake sing. 2 days later, a storm finally came with a violence that felt like relief. The lake rose 2 inches, then 4. The steeple retreated like a needle being pushed down through cloth. Tourists went home. The Corps pretended not to be happy. The game warden, who had been found with his feet in the water, stopped by the shop and bought a pack of sunflower seeds and looked out the door as if the sky were in on a joke. He said he was sleeping fine now. He said he might take his wife to Choctaw for a show. When he left, my grandfather said the man was a liar, and then immediately said he did not mean that. He went to his room and closed the door, and I heard him praying or cussing, which can sound the same when an old man is tired. Life slid toward normal the way a chair slides toward the exact spot where your body remembers it belongs. We sold minnows. We replaced 2 worn trailer tires. We ordered new hooks and a case of energy drinks that tasted like melted candy and caffeine in a can. There were no more whispers. Not that anyone would admit to hearing. The bait shop photograph went back to showing 1 child on the steps. My grandfather's list sat under the phone with a coffee ring right over the name of the drowned boy. You might think the story ends there, with a superstition meeting a rainstorm and losing. It does not. I wish it did. September came hard and hot, then paled at the edges. Your body recognizes the slant of the sun even when the thermometer lies to your face. Leaves crisped early on the hackberries and stroked the lake like fingertips. The wind went back to carrying other conversations. And then one morning the lake fell a half-foot in a day without a weather reason. You can watch the level gauges if you are bored and see the numbers creep. They do not creep. They toppled. The Corps said they were lowering for inspection of intake. Fishermen said someone had left a gate open. My grandfather said it had found a path. The steeple came back like a tooth through gum. The old road showed its straight intention to keep going under the water and out the other side. The whispers did not wait for evening this time. They came with the first breath of heat. I went out in the John boat alone before my grandfather could decide to come with me. I told myself I was going to put new buoys around the steeple. I took a coil of rope and the boat hook and a handful of zip ties and a small courage I had left in the pocket of a jacket since last winter and forgotten. I beached at the bronze line where the water had been yesterday and pushed off. The lake was slick in that way that makes you think of a large animal that has chosen, for now, not to roll over. As I approached the steeple, the whispers stepped into words the way a shadow steps into light and becomes a person. They said a name. It was mine. I did not jump because I was out of jumps. I went closer and leaned with the boat hook and felt that nice silly tap again, that clink of something metal wearing wood like clothes. I looked down into the water and saw the shape of the steeple go on and on like a tree. Spires are not long. They taper and end. This one went into the lake like a spear. I saw chisel marks on the wood. No, not chisel marks, scratch marks. Letters pressed shallow and then deeper with impatience. I let the hook drag the algae away and read what someone had cut into the grain. It was a list of names. They were not the old names in the old script you might expect. They were the names of people who had been on the lake this summer. I saw Reese, I saw the warden. I saw my grandfather's first name with his middle initial. And then below them, scratched lighter as if made with a nail that was running out of point. I saw mine. There are stories where people do not do the smart thing because a story that ends with someone doing the smart thing is not a story. I did the smart thing. I let go of the hook and pushed the motor to life and turned the bow toward the cove, and I made the smallest waves that motor would make so I did not flip the boat like a fool. I came in faster than I meant to and bumped the dock and tied off sloppy. I went into the shop and took down the photograph and slid the image out of its cheap frame. There was nothing written there. No second child. No smudge of a second pair of shoes. I held it up to the light and the paper looked clean. Then I turned it over and saw that someone had taped another photograph behind the first, and that this second one was the same image, and that now there were 3 children on the steps. I could have laughed then if my mouth had not been so dry. Who does this? What kid with a printer is having this kind of fun? I thought about teenagers and YouTubers and how every place becomes content to someone who does not have to live next to it. I put the photographs back and went to find my grandfather. He was in his room in the ranch house behind the shop, sitting on the bed with his hands on his knees. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had stayed too long in a place where silence weighs what a life weighs. He asked me to help him with his boots. When they were off, he asked me to take him to the dock. I did not argue. He stood in his socks with his toes gripping the boards as if the wood might drift. He told me then that when he was young, he had courted a girl from a family that lived in the flats at Preston. He had taken her to the church the steeple belonged to, not because he was much for sermons, but because there was a way she smiled afterward that made him feel taller. She had a brother who was not right in his head but could sing like he had a bird in his throat. During one flood year, they had to move their furniture upstairs, and the brother decided to take the church bell rope and tie it to the front steps to make a joke, as if a house could call for help. The water came fast anyway. The brother slipped. The rope did what rope does. My grandfather had cut him down while their father was at the river, trying to pull a pig out of a pecan tree. They buried the boy in the dry month that followed. Then the Corps came with their maps that looked like promises. He was not invited to the girl's wedding. She married a man who moved her to Gainesville. He had not thought about this in 50 years. That was a lie. He had thought about it every time the wind came from the north and lifted the edge of the lake's skin. The water spoke. Not loud, not a boom or a crack, a murmur like the voice a man uses to say, sorry when the person who needs to hear it is in another room. My grandfather leaned forward. He had the look of a kid staring through the glass at a candy he cannot afford and will steal if dared. He took a step. I grabbed the back of his shirt and said we would go out together if we went anywhere at all. He said he would not argue that. We sat on the dock and let the afternoon go strange. The sun faded into haze. Crickets took over with their simple song that is faithful because it has no words to betray. Out on the lake, a shape rose and fell and rose again. It was too small for a boat. It was too regular for a fish. It was a hat, a broad-brimmed thing in the style men wore when a man's hat said he had a job and a place to be. It lifted and dipped and turned as if looking for its head. My grandfather made a sound that is not in any language. The next morning I woke to the sound of a skiff rubbing against the dock post and a coffee pot that had boiled itself dry. My grandfather had written a note on the yellow paper where his list had been. It said that you know when something under you gives way, and that he was sorry for not telling me sooner. It said to take the money from the metal box and fix the roof this winter. It said that when the lake comes low and the steeple shows, some things that were tied want to be taken. It did not say where he was going. He had taken the John boat and a coil of rope and a folding chair as if he were headed to a church picnic on the lake bed. I ran down the old road that stuck out of the water like a backbone, and I could see him, a small figure standing in his boat under the shadow of the steeple. And then I could not see him, as if a hand had moved in front of my eyes. They found the boat 2 hours later, 300 yards off where it should have been, with the rope coiled neat and the chair folded and the outboard dry as a stone. We dragged hooks in the area until the men with the boat hooks made me stop. They told me he had always wanted to go easy. I told them he had not wanted to go anywhere. They said the lake gives and the lake takes, and the river does not care which side of the line you stand. The game warden came and stood with his cap off, and then ground it back down as if trying to squeeze manners back into his head. The teenagers came and sat on the bridge abutment and pretended to feel bad about something they could not name. Someone hung a ribbon on the mesquite that had been drowned to the knuckles most of its life. A week later, I went back out to the steeple alone. It had taken on a tilt. That might have been in my eye. The whispers had learned my name well. They spoke it like a neighbor borrowing sugar. They did not threaten. I put my hand on the wood where the metal road inside made a chill. I looked down and saw the names again and saw a gap, a space where a name should be but was not yet. I thought about taking a knife and scratching my own there, beating it to the punch, writing what would be written whether I wrote it or not. I did not. I went home and took down the photograph and threw it away and immediately regretted it, as if that act somehow freed whatever bound those faces to paper. I learned, as you learn the shape of a bruise, that the lake keeps what it is owed. That fall it crept back up and hid the steeple in the road and the fool foundations that ask for walls. Winter brought ducks and the sound of wings you can feel in your jaw. The bait shop was quiet. Men told me they were sorry about Webb, and then bought minnows and told me where they planned to hide from their wives on the water. The Corps wrote a letter that said a memorial bench would be placed near the cove. I sat on the dock one night when the stars were so many it made you mad, and I put my feet in the water with my boots on, like a man playing at some game he thought he was too old for. I waited for the whispers to become words. They did not. I slept there until dawn put a sheen on the boards. You can still smell it some nights, that cellar smell. The breathing of a place that was forced to trade dust for silt. Folks say the steeple will come back when the lake runs low again. I know it will. The road will show straight as regret. People will drive out in their clean trucks and take pictures and wait for something to happen that looks good on a screen. It will not look good. It will feel like a hand on the back of your neck when you think you are alone in a room. It will not be dramatic. It will be faithful. A voice with no throat will speak a name, and it will be yours if you have stayed too long or left too fast or tied something to the wrong place. And you will feel the truth of it in your teeth. A man from Dallas came by the shop last week, the kind who pays with 3 thick bills for a $10 cooler and does not wait for change. He asked if I knew where the church was under the water. I told him churches are not buildings, and he said he did not drive up here for theology. He went out alone. He came back pale and smiling like a person who has made a bad deal and convinced himself it was a good one. He took out his phone to show me a photograph he should not have taken. It was the steeple slanting out of the lake like a hatpin. The surface between his boat and the spire was not water. It was faces pressing up from below, cheeks flattened by some mercy we do not deserve. Their eyes were not angry. They looked as that second child in the second photograph had looked, ashamed of something that had not happened yet. I told him to delete the picture. He said the cloud kept everything. I told him that was the problem and that he should go home. At the end of all this, there is no lesson except the one the lake taught me. Water remembers what towns forget. A church bell rope knots itself again no matter how careful you unloop it. A steeple that is not made right and not made wrong holds fast no matter how the wind works at it. The road does not end where the water begins. It goes on in a line nobody can drive, but most of us will take. Stand long enough on the mud at Preston Bend when the lake runs low, and you will hear the drowned whisper. They will not tell you a story with a moral. They will say your name with the patience of a mother and the certainty of a debt collector. If you answer, you will step forward as if someone has laid a plank before you that your foot cannot refuse. If you do not, you will still step forward someday, maybe in a room with no water in it, because lakes are not places on a map. They are choices that keep being made after the first choice is forgotten. I sometimes dream the church has lifted entire, shining with river light, and that the congregation has come out in their wrong clothes, and that my grandfather is there with his socks wet, lifting his hat to a girl who married someone else. I sometimes wake with the smell of algae and hymnals in my nose. I sit up and listen to the dark like a dog. I pour coffee that tastes like a roofing nail soaked in rainwater, and go out to the dock and watch the surface go gray. Somewhere under there is a list with my name on it. Somewhere above it is the sky that keeps not falling. Between them is a steeple that does not belong to either and refuses to rot. On still mornings, I take the boat out and idle in the mist and let the engine clack itself quiet and breathe with the water. I do not say my name. I do not say any names. The lake knows them fine without me. The first time I heard about Toya was through a trucker who swore the desert there breathed differently at night. He was the kind of man who'd seen everything Texas could throw at you. Dust storms, oil fires, hitchhikers with dead eyes. But when he told me about the train that never stopped, I could see a kind of tremor behind his weathered face. He said Toya was nothing but a husk of a town now. A few falling down houses, a gutted general store, and a station that had no purpose anymore. But sometimes, he claimed, when the night was thin and the wind got caught just right, a train still thundered through. An engine with no cars, a scream of steel and iron that tore across the desert, but never arrived anywhere. At the time, I thought he was just filling the silence on the road, but months later, curiosity drove me west. And when I got to Toya, I wished I'd never gone looking for the sound. The desert around Toya is like a graveyard of old things. Rusting cars, wind-torn billboards, animal bones bleached pale under a sky that seems endless. The station sat on the edge of town, its roof caved in on one side, tracks stretching toward nothing. I parked my car and walked along those tracks as the sun melted into the horizon, the sky a bloody smear over the flat earth. The air smelled dry, metallic, like rain that never came. The town was silent, except for a sagging screen door creaking on some forgotten house. I could feel it immediately. That sense of waiting, as if the place itself was holding its breath for something. I told myself I was imagining it, but every step closer to the tracks felt heavier, like I was walking into a story I wasn't supposed to be part of. By midnight, the stars were sharp and cruel overhead, the kind of stars you only see in places too empty for comfort. I sat on the cracked concrete platform, half laughing at myself for waiting. That's when it started. The vibration came first, subtle at my feet like a pulse in the earth. Then the sound rolled in, low at first. A distant growl that swelled until it filled the night, rattling my bones. A horn split the dark, mournful and furious, the unmistakable wail of a train engine. I stood heart hammering, staring down the tracks. And then I saw it. An engine tearing through the desert, black and gleaming, its light cutting a jagged path across the sand. No cars trailed behind it. Just a solitary beast of steel screaming toward the station. The platform shook as it roared past me, the blast of air hot, smelling of coal and rust, though no smoke followed it. My eyes watered from the force, and before I could even think, it was gone, swallowed by the desert beyond. The sound lingered in my chest long after silence returned. I should have left then. I should have taken it as the ghost story it was and gone home. But something about it hooked into me. Why did the train run? Where did it go? I stayed another night, and another. Each time it came, the same hour, the same fury. Each time it passed the station without slowing, without a single passenger or cargo. The third night, though, I noticed something that froze the blood in me. In the glare of its headlight, just for a moment, I saw faces in the windows that weren't there. Pale, hollow faces pressed against the glass. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes black and empty. They were gone as quick as they appeared, but I knew what I saw. The engine wasn't empty. It carried something. Or someone. Sleep stopped coming easy after that. I would dream of the train's horn tearing me out of bed, only to wake and hear it faintly in the distance hours before it should have come. I wandered the town during the day, desperate for answers, and found a man who still lived there, though calling him alive seemed generous. His name was Carl, skin tough and wrinkled like leather, eyes filmed over with cataracts. He sat on his porch with a shotgun across his lap and watched me with suspicion until I asked him about the train. His face tightened and he spat into the dirt. "That engine ain't bound for no place the living go," he said. "Used to be a wreck. Long time ago. Train never made it. Went off the tracks down past Pecos, burned everybody alive. But the thing about it is, you can still hear it, still see it. Been running ever since, like it don't know it's dead. Like it's looking for a station it can finally stop at." He leaned closer then, his breath sour and hot. "Thing is, boy, it don't just run. Sometimes it takes. You stand too close, you listen too hard, you'll find yourself on it. And once you're on, you don't get off." I didn't believe him, not fully, not until the fifth night. That's when the engine came earlier. Horn shrieking, louder than ever, and the ground shuddered like the desert was splitting open. I stood back from the platform, but this time the train slowed. My chest locked as the headlight bore down on me, brighter than the sun, heat blasting against my skin. The engine screeched as if tearing metal, sparks flying from wheels that never touched the rusted tracks. And in the glare I saw them again. The faces, dozens of them pressed against invisible windows, eyes hollow, hands clawing at the glass. But this time I heard them too. A chorus of voices, faint at first, then rising above the roar of the engine, crying, pleading, their words broken but desperate. "Come with us. Come with us." I stumbled backward, but the sound wrapped around me, pulling, dragging. The air thickened, heavy with smoke that wasn't there, the taste of burning metal in my throat. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move right, like the ground had softened, like I was sinking into it. The light grew hotter, searing, and when I looked down at my arms, I swear I saw them. Pale hands, too many hands, gripping me, pulling me forward. I screamed, and the sound vanished under the train's horn. Just when I thought I was gone, just when the heat blistered my skin and the ground fell away, it passed. The light blinked out. The earth went still, and I collapsed on the platform, my body shaking, my throat raw. I left Toya that night, driving east until dawn broke, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But here's the thing. That was weeks ago. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed, the night quiet around me, I hear it again. The low rumble beneath me. The wail of a horn, faint but getting closer. I live nowhere near the tracks now, nowhere near Toya, but the sound is finding me. And when I close my eyes, I see them waiting in the dark windows, their mouths still open, their hands still reaching, as if they know I almost joined them, and they won't stop until I do.